It began with engines that coughed instead of roared. In the Ardennes Forest, winter pressed down on everything, trees bowed under snow, roads hardened into ice, breath crystallized in the air, but nothing felt the cold more cruelly than steel that could no longer move. Tanks sat motionless beneath pine branches, their silhouettes dark and imposing, their guns still pointed west. Trucks idled too long and fell silent. Half-tracks were abandoned where they stood, frozen into place like monuments to a promise that could not be kept. The German Ardennes offensive was still moving on maps, still advancing in orders and expectations, but on the ground, something invisible was already strangling it. Fuel, not courage, not planning, not numbers, fuel. For years, Germany had fought a war that burned gasoline faster than it could ever be replaced. Refineries had been bombed, synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins, rail lines were shattered, stockpiles dwindled until every drop was counted, guarded, argued over. By the winter of 1944, fuel was no longer a resource, it was a fantasy stretched thin by desperation. And yet, the Ardennes offensive demanded fuel in impossible quantities. Panzer divisions were expected to surge through forests, punch through Allied lines, race westward toward distant bridges, and keep moving without pause. The plan depended on speed, momentum, and surprise. Tanks were loaded with just enough fuel to reach captured Allied depots that existed on maps, but not always in reality. The gamble was brutal in its simplicity: capture, fuel, or stop. As the offensive began, German armoured columns rolled forward, under cover of darkness and snow. Engines growled, tracks churned ice and mud, and for a brief moment, movement returned a sense of purpose. Crews believed, or forced themselves to believe, that fuel would be found ahead, that the gamble would pay off, that speed alone could overcome scarcity. But winter does not reward belief. Fuel consumption soared as vehicles struggled against icy roads and deep snow. Engines burned more just to stay warm. Detours around destroyed bridges added miles that had never been planned. Traffic jams formed in narrow forest roads where columns stalled behind broken-down vehicles that could not be moved because there was nothing left in their tanks. Drivers watched their gauges with growing dread. Commanders recalculated distances again and again. Orders changed hourly. Units were rerouted not toward objectives, but toward rumours of fuel dumps that might still exist. Some tanks advanced only to halt a few miles later, crews draining the last drops from reserve cans while artillery thundered somewhere ahead. Others were pushed forward by hand to clear roads. Entire formations slowed to walking pace, their momentum bleeding away one frozen mile at a time. And then there were the moments of terrible clarity. A Panther crew abandoning a perfectly functional tank because it could not move. An officer ordering vehicles destroyed so they would not fall into enemy hands. Infantry marching past rows of immobilized armor, steel giants rendered useless by emptiness. Mechanics tearing apart wrecks, siphoning fuel from shattered machines under fire. Fuel became the axis around which every decision turned. German commanders issued orders restricting movement to the bare minimum. Engines were shut down whenever possible, even in freezing temperatures. Crews slept beside vehicles not just for warmth, but to protect them from being stripped by other units just as desperate. Tension spread as formations competed quietly for the same dwindling supplies. Then came the skies clearing. When Allied aircraft returned, the fuel crisis deepened into catastrophe. Columns that could not disperse became targets. Vehicles stalled on roads were destroyed where they sat. Supply trucks burned before reaching the front. What little fuel remained was lost in explosions that lit the winter sky black with smoke. The Ardennes offensive began to slow, not because resistance grew stronger, but because movement became impossible. Units that were supposed to advance pivoted into defensive roles. Tanks became static pillboxes. Ambitious thrusts collapsed into local holding actions. German forces that had pushed deep found themselves stranded, unable to retreat quickly, unable to advance at all. Fuel starvation turned success into vulnerability. In places like Bastogne, German units circled the town but could not concentrate their strength. Tanks ran low before they could reposition. Artillery support thinned as resupply failed. Attacks lost coordination as vehicles were abandoned in forests and fields, hidden under branches like wounded animals. Every mile gained without fuel became a trap. As days passed, the crisis worsened. Fuel convoys never arrived. Captured depots proved empty or destroyed. Vehicles froze solid overnight. Engines cracked. Batteries died. What began as a bold offensive became a slow unraveling driven not by defeat in battle, but by arithmetic, by consumption exceeding reality. German soldiers understood it instinctively. They felt it every time a vehicle failed to start, every time an order was delayed because movement was impossible, every time retreat meant leaving behind machines that had once symbolized power. The war narrowed around them, shrinking from grand strategy to immediate survival. By the time the Ardennes fighting turned fully against Germany, the fuel crisis had already decided the outcome. The offensive had burned itself out, consuming resources that could never be replaced. Tanks that should have raced across Belgium instead became obstacles clogging roads. Speed, the soul of armoured warfare, had vanished. What remained was winter, exhaustion, and the slow, grinding retreat through forests where frozen vehicles marked the path of a failed gamble. Tonight, we return to that invisible battlefield, to the fuel gauges ticking downward, to the engines falling silent, to the roads where momentum died quietly, to the realization that modern war can be lost not only by gunfire, but by absence, by what never arrives. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something calm and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what hour has settled around you? Is it late and quiet, or is the day slowly letting go? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the fuel crisis in the Ardennes reminds us how fragile momentum really is, how progress can vanish when the resources behind it run dry. In your own life, has there been a moment when something important slowed or stopped, not because of failure, but because the energy behind it was gone? If it feels right, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, quiet journeys into the hidden mechanics of history help your thoughts slow, your breathing soften, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. September 16th, 1944. Deep in the Prussian forests of East Prussia, inside the concrete bunker complex known as the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler spread a military map across the heavy oak table in his conference room. His right hand trembled as it always did now, a visible manifestation of the Parkinson's disease eating away at his nervous system, but his finger traced a line across Belgium with unwavering determination. The destination was Antwerp, 125 miles to the northwest through the Ardennes Forest. The generals surrounding him, hardened men who had conquered Poland, France, and nearly the Soviet Union, stood in stunned silence. What Hitler was proposing wasn't audacious, it was mathematically impossible. The operation bore the deliberately misleading codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, designed to sound defensive when intercepted by Allied intelligence. But there was nothing defensive about what Hitler envisioned. He wanted to split the Allied armies in half, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans into a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to turn its full attention back to the Eastern Front. It was the strategic logic of a man who still believed in the miracle of 1940, when German panzers had torn through France in 6 weeks and forced the British army into the sea at Dunkirk. That lightning victory had required 3 million gallons of fuel for 220 miles of breakthrough. What Hitler now proposed would require 4.5 million gallons to travel 125 miles through mountains, forests, and winter weather. And Germany no longer had even a fraction of that fuel available. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, presented the logistics briefing with the careful precision of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. The offensive would require 250,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,000 artillery pieces, concentrated in a 50-mile sector of the weakly held Ardennes front. The fuel requirement calculation was brutally simple. Each panzer division needed approximately 300,000 gallons for the initial phase of operations. Multiply that by 10 divisions, and you reached 3 million gallons before accounting for support vehicles, reconnaissance units, artillery tractors, and the thousands of trucks that would carry the infantry forward. Add those in, and the number climbed to 4.5 million gallons minimum, enough fuel to fill 70 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The room fell silent as Jodl finished speaking. Every officer present knew that Germany's current daily production of synthetic fuel stood at roughly 1,000 tons, which translated to approximately 330,000 gallons. In other words, Germany needed more fuel for this single operation than it could produce in 2 full weeks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled from retirement to command Army Group West, privately referred to the plan as this damned offensive when speaking with his aide. At 70 years old, Rundstedt represented the old Prussian military tradition of cold-eyed pragmatism. And what he saw in Hitler's plan was fantasy masquerading as strategy. He had attended the planning sessions throughout October as 6th Panzer Army commanders submitted fuel requisition requests that exceeded Germany's entire weekly national production. He watched Sepp Dietrich, the former Hitler bodyguard who now commanded 6th Panzer Army, nod enthusiastically at objectives his tanks couldn't possibly reach. He listened as logistics officers gently tried to explain the fuel situation, only to be cut off by Hitler's insistence that captured American fuel depots would solve the supply problem. It was strategic planning built on wishful thinking, and Rundstedt knew that wishful thinking had never filled a fuel tank. The operational timeline Hitler demanded made the fuel problem even more acute. The advance had to reach Antwerp within 7 days, which meant covering 18 miles per day through terrain that heavily favoured defenders. Panther tanks, Germany's primary medium tank, achieved roughly 1.5 miles per gallon on roads, and half that when moving cross-country through mud and snow. Tiger II heavy tanks, the most powerful armoured vehicles in the world, consumed fuel at a staggering rate of less than 1 mile per gallon under combat conditions. A simple calculation revealed the problem. To move 125 miles, a Panther would need roughly 83 gallons at best-case road efficiency. But combat operations, with manoeuvring, idling, and repositioning, would easily triple that figure. Multiply those individual vehicle requirements across 1,400 tanks, and the fuel shortage became a chasm that no amount of optimism could bridge. Yet the planning continued through October and November with an increasingly surreal quality, as if the entire German High Command had agreed to collectively ignore physical reality. Model, who commanded Army Group B and would oversee the tactical execution, assembled detailed attack plans showing penetration routes, objective timelines, and bridge seizure operations. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army staff created elaborate movement tables coordinating the flow of divisions through narrow forest roads. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army developed careful infantry infiltration schemes to create breakthrough corridors for the armour. Each plan was professionally competent, tactically sound, and logistically impossible. The officers creating these documents knew they were designing an offensive that would run dry within 2 days of launching, yet they continued working because Hitler demanded it, and the Nazi state did not tolerate defeatist calculations. The most chilling aspect of the planning was the fuel capture assumption that German logistics officers built into their calculations. Pre-offensive intelligence had identified 14 major American fuel depot locations between the German start line and the Meuse River, estimated to contain between 3 and 5 million gallons of fuel. The operational plan simply assumed these depots would be captured intact and their contents immediately available to German forces. It was planning by fantasy, inserting enemy supplies into your own logistics chain as if they were already secured. When junior officers questioned this assumption, they were told that speed and surprise would prevent American demolition of the depots. When they asked what would happen if the depots were destroyed or already evacuated, they received no answer. The plan required capturing Allied fuel within the first 48 hours, or the offensive would collapse. There was no contingency for failure. The visual evidence of Germany's fuel poverty could be seen at every tank depot and assembly area in the weeks before the offensive. Newly manufactured Panther tanks sat in perfect rows at the Magdeburg production facility, each one a marvel of German engineering with its sloped armour and powerful 75mm gun. But they sat motionless, awaiting fuel allocations that would never come. At the Paderborn training grounds, entire companies of Tiger IIs remained stationary because there wasn't enough diesel to allow drivers even basic familiarization training. The Luftwaffe had hundreds of fighters grounded at air bases across Germany, their pilots idle because every drop of aviation fuel was being hoarded for a hypothetical air support mission during the offensive. Germany had built a magnificent war machine and then strangled it for lack of petroleum. The Ardennes offensive would be launched by an army that was already logistically dead. In late November, as the offensive's launch date approached, Hitler held a final planning conference at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He spoke for 3 hours to the assembled division commanders, his voice rising and falling as he wove together strategic vision, historical parallel, and sheer will. He invoked Frederick the Great's miraculous reversals in the 7 Years' War, suggesting that Germany stood at a similar moment when boldness could transform certain defeat into unexpected victory. He promised that the offensive would shatter Allied morale, drive a wedge between the British and Americans, and buy Germany time to deploy the new jet fighters and V weapons that would turn the technological tide. What he didn't mention was fuel. The word appeared nowhere in his 3-hour address. It was as if Hitler believed that by not speaking the word, he could make the problem cease to exist. As the commanders filed out of the conference, many exchanged glances that communicated what they dared not speak aloud. They had just received orders to launch the Third Reich's final strategic offensive, an operation that would commit Germany's last armoured reserves. And everyone in that room knew it was doomed before the first shot was fired. The fuel didn't exist. The American depots wouldn't be captured intact. The weather wouldn't hold forever. The Allied air forces would return. But none of that mattered because Hitler had ordered it, and in Nazi Germany, the Führer's will superseded mathematics, logistics, and physical reality. The Ardennes offensive would proceed not because it could succeed, but because Hitler demanded it. And so 1,400 tanks began moving toward their assembly areas, burning precious fuel just to reach the start line, advancing toward an objective they would never reach because they would run dry long before they got there. May 12, 1944, 7:30 in the morning. Werner Schultz stood on the observation platform of the Leuna synthetic fuel plant near Merseburg, watching 935 American heavy bombers fill the sky above him like a metallic thunderstorm. For 2 decades, Schultz had worked as a chemical engineer at this facility, Germany's largest synthetic fuel plant, overseeing the complex catalytic processes that transformed brown coal into gasoline and diesel. He had helped expand the plant through the 1930s, watched it become the crown jewel of Germany's petroleum independence program, and now he stood frozen as the first bombs began falling. In 20 minutes, the work of 20 years would be reduced to twisted metal and shattered catalyst towers. The synthetic miracle that had allowed Germany to fight a mechanized war without natural oil fields was about to unravel. Germany's synthetic fuel program was born from necessity and desperation. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany without colonies, without overseas oil sources, and without the means to import petroleum in the quantities a modern military required. German chemists, led by Friedrich Burgius and Franz Fischer, had developed 2 revolutionary processes for creating liquid fuel from Germany's abundant coal deposits. The Burgius process used hydrogen under extreme pressure to liquefy coal directly, while the Fischer-Tropsch method converted coal-derived synthesis gas into liquid hydrocarbons. By the early 1930s, Germany had operational plants producing thousands of barrels per month. By 1944, the country had 91 synthetic fuel facilities scattered across Germany and occupied territories, producing 316,000 barrels per month at their peak. It was an engineering achievement without parallel, allowing a nation with virtually no natural petroleum to build and fuel the most mechanized military force in history. The Leuna plant that Werner Schultz watched burn represented the pinnacle of this achievement. Covering over 2 square miles, the facility contained over 1,200 buildings, processing units, catalyst towers, and storage tanks. The Burgius process it employed required temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit and pressures reaching 300 atmospheres, conditions that demanded exotic alloys, specialized vessels, and catalysts made from rare metals like molybdenum and tungsten. The plant's complexity meant it took trained engineers months to understand its operation and years to master its optimization. This complexity also made it extraordinarily vulnerable. A modern refinery processing natural crude oil could sustain considerable damage and continue operating at reduced capacity, but a coal liquefaction plant was a precisely balanced chemical system where damage to any major component could cascade through the entire process, shutting down production completely. The Americans understood this vulnerability with scientific precision. In April 1944, the Allied oil campaign formally began when General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, convinced Eisenhower to prioritize Germany's petroleum infrastructure above all other targets. Spaatz's staff had spent months studying German fuel production, analyzing reconnaissance photos, and identifying critical bottlenecks. Their conclusion was ruthlessly simple: destroy the synthetic fuel plants, and you destroy German mobility. The Luftwaffe would be grounded. The panzer divisions would be immobilized. The Wehrmacht would transform from a motorized modern army into a horse-drawn force from the previous century. On May 12, 1944, that campaign began in earnest over Leuna. The raid that Werner Schultz witnessed was a masterpiece of precision destruction. The 935 B-17 flying fortresses approached in tight box formations, protected by 600 P-51 Mustang fighters that suppressed the German air defences. At precisely 29,000 feet, the lead bombardiers acquired their target markers and released. The bombs fell in a carefully calculated pattern, designed not for area destruction but for surgical dismantling. High explosive bombs shattered the catalyst towers and pressure vessels. Incendiary bombs ignited the hydrocarbon processing units. Delayed action bombs buried themselves in foundations and detonated hours later, killing repair crews and preventing immediate recovery efforts. When the last bomber left, Leuna's production capacity had been reduced from 60,000 barrels per month to effectively zero. The repair crews estimated 6 months minimum for restoration, but 6 months was time Germany would never receive. The Americans returned to Leuna on May 28th, June 29th, July 21st, and August 24th, each raid inflicting fresh damage before repairs from the previous attack could be completed. The pattern repeated across every major synthetic fuel plant in Germany. Pellets on the Baltic coast faced its first major raid on June 20th and was struck 7 more times by October. Blechhammer in Upper Silesia received 13 major raids between July and November. Bruchs in Czechoslovakia, Skolven in the Ruhr, Berlin near Leipzig. Each plant appeared on the target lists again and again, bombed methodically until production ceased entirely. The Americans had discovered that destroying synthetic fuel plants wasn't about obliterating them completely, but about breaking them faster than they could be fixed. By August 1944, the results were catastrophic for Germany. Production that had reached 316,000 barrels per month in April had collapsed to 90,000 barrels in August. By September, it stood at 50,000 barrels. By November, when planning for the Ardennes offensive was reaching its final stages, German synthetic fuel production had fallen to 17,000 barrels per month, a 95% reduction from peak capacity. To put this in perspective, the German Wehrmacht required approximately 260,000 barrels per month for normal operations. They were now receiving less than 7% of their requirement. The Ardennes offensive would demand 4.5 million gallons, roughly 100,000 barrels, for its initial phase. Germany's entire monthly synthetic fuel production could fill just 17% of the offensive's fuel requirement. The collapse wasn't just about quantity, but about irreplaceable components. Dr. Hermann Fischer, a chemist at the Leuna plant who survived the May bombing, spent months attempting to restore production, only to discover that the catalysts required for the Bulge process were no longer obtainable. The rare metal compounds needed specific manufacturing facilities, most of which were now destroyed or cut off in territories Germany no longer controlled. The specialized pressure vessels that could withstand 300 atmospheres required months of fabrication time and materials Germany could no longer spare. The trained engineers who understood the process were either dead, drafted into the army, or scattered across multiple damaged facilities, all trying simultaneously to restore production. Each repair revealed new damage. Each restoration attempt uncovered supply chain dependencies that no longer existed. In late November 1944, Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, sat in his office reviewing production reports that read like a chronicle of industrial death. The charts and graphs told an undeniable story. Germany's fuel production would not recover. The synthetic plants could not be adequately defended, could not be rapidly repaired, and could not produce sufficient fuel even if left unmolested. Speer had already presented these figures to Hitler multiple times, each meeting ending with the Führer dismissing the data as defeatist or claiming that new technologies would solve the crisis. But there were no new technologies. There was only coal that couldn't be liquefied fast enough, catalysts that couldn't be replaced, and an Allied bombing campaign that returned every time repairs began. The Ardennes offensive was being planned around fuel that had already gone up in smoke over Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer. The final blow to Germany's synthetic fuel production came not from American bombs but from Soviet tanks. Romania had provided Germany with approximately 200,000 barrels per month of natural crude oil from the Ploiești fields, the country's only significant source of conventional petroleum. On August 23, 1944, Romania switched sides and joined the Allies. Within days, Soviet forces occupied the Ploiești fields. Germany lost 200,000 barrels per month of irreplaceable natural petroleum in a single afternoon of political realignment. When combined with the 95% reduction in synthetic fuel production, Germany's total petroleum availability for November 1944 stood at roughly 1/10 of what it had been in January. The Third Reich was fighting a mechanized war with the fuel reserves of a minor regional power. And now Hitler wanted to launch the war's largest offensive. April 19th, 1944, Allied Expeditionary Force headquarters outside London. General Karl Spaatz spread reconnaissance photographs across the conference table in front of Dwight Eisenhower and studied them with the intensity of a chess master examining a winning position. The photos showed German synthetic fuel plants in extraordinary detail: buildings, roads, storage tanks, even individual vehicles visible in the parking areas. Spaatz had been arguing for months that strategic bombing should target Germany's petroleum infrastructure, rather than dispersing effort across industrial cities, transportation networks, and military production facilities. Now, he was ready to make his final case. He tapped one photograph showing the lunar plant near Merseburg. "Give me 6 months of clear weather and priority targeting," he told Eisenhower, "and the Wehrmacht won't move." It was a bold promise. It was also completely accurate. The Allied oil campaign represented a fundamental shift in strategic bombing doctrine. Since 1942, British Bomber Command under Arthur Harris had pursued area bombing of German cities, attempting to destroy industrial capacity and civilian morale through sheer destructive tonnage. The Americans had theoretically embraced precision daylight bombing, but in practice, bad weather, poor navigation, and fierce German defences had often reduced their raids to area attacks, little different from the British night operations. Results had been mixed at best. German industrial production actually increased through 1943, despite the bombing. But petroleum was different. Unlike dispersed factories or resilient urban infrastructure, synthetic fuel production concentrated in a limited number of large, complex, and extraordinarily vulnerable facilities. You couldn't move a coal liquefaction plant underground or disperse it across dozens of small workshops. The entire German fuel supply depended on 91 specific installations that could be identified, targeted, and systematically destroyed. Spaatz's plan was built on intelligence that the Americans had been gathering since 1942 through a combination of aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, and most crucially, ultra-intercepts of German communications decoded at Bletchley Park in England. By early 1944, Allied intelligence officers had precise data on German fuel production, consumption, and storage. They knew which plants produced the most. They understood the dependencies between facilities. They had identified the critical bottlenecks: catalyst production, hydrogen compression, specialized refining equipment. The reconnaissance photographs were so detailed that analysts could count individual catalyst towers and measure the dimensions of pressure vessels. This was precision targeting on a level never before attempted, and it required precision execution to match. The execution began on May 12th with the devastating raid on Leuna, but that was merely the opening move in a 5-month campaign that would become the most successful strategic bombing operation of World War II. Between May and September 1944, American heavy bombers dropped 175,000 tons of ordnance on German petroleum targets, roughly 1/4 of all bombs dropped by American forces in that period. The raids employed sophisticated tactics, refined over 3 years of combat. Bomber streams approached at staggered altitudes to confuse German flak predictors. Fighter escorts suppressed German interceptors using superior numbers and aircraft performance. Lead bombardiers used the Norden bomb site in clear weather to place bombs within 1,000 feet of aim points with 60% reliability. When weather obscured visual targeting, Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2X radar marked targets with colored smoke, allowing formation bombing that still achieved reasonable accuracy. Captain James Mitchell, bombardier aboard the B-17 Memphis Belle II, flew his 28th mission on May 28, 1944, the second major raid on the Pulitz synthetic fuel plant near Stettin. From 29,000 feet, he watched his bombs fall away and track toward the massive complex below, following their arc through streams of black flak bursts that filled the sky around his aircraft. The bombs impacted in a rippling chain of explosions, each detonation followed by secondary blasts as fuel stores and processing equipment exploded. Within 30 seconds, a pillar of black smoke climbed to 15,000 feet, marking another German synthetic plant effectively destroyed. Mitchell's formation lost 3 aircraft to flak and fighters, 30 men dead or missing, but the reconnaissance photos taken the next day showed Pulitz's monthly production reduced from 45,000 barrels to 0. It was a brutal Mathematics: 30 American lives exchanged for 45,000 barrels per month of fuel production Germany would never regain. The Germans attempted to defend their petroleum infrastructure with everything they had left. Flak batteries surrounding major plants created some of the densest anti-aircraft fire in history. The Leuna plant alone was protected by over 600 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from 88mm heavy flak to 20mm light autocannons. Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept bomber formations, engaging in desperate battles at altitudes where thin air taxed both engines and pilots. Plant managers implemented elaborate camouflage schemes, covering facilities with netting and false structures, pumping smoke to obscure targeting, even constructing dummy plants miles away to draw bombing. Repair crews worked around the clock under combat conditions, attempting to restore production while knowing the next raid could come at any moment. But none of it mattered. The Americans came back. They always came back. The intelligence picture painted by Ultra Intercepts revealed the campaign's devastating effectiveness even more clearly than bomb damage assessments. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts reading decoded German military communications watched German commanders growing increasingly desperate about fuel shortages as early as June 1944. Luftwaffe sortie rates plummeted as aviation fuel vanished. Panzer divisions reported training cancelled for lack of diesel. Army group commanders pleaded for fuel allocations to conduct even basic defensive maneuvers. By August, Ultra Intercepts showed German fuel reserves in Western Europe had fallen below a 2-week supply for minimal operations. By October, those reserves had contracted to less than 1 week. The messages grew more frantic, more desperate, and more indicative of a military force slowly dying from petroleum starvation. At RAF Medmenham in Buckinghamshire, the Central Interpretation Unit employed thousands of photo interpreters, many of them Women's Auxiliary Air Force members who examined reconnaissance imagery through magnifying glasses and stereoscopes, identifying bomb damage and tracking German repair efforts. Each synthetic fuel plant had its own file containing hundreds of photographs taken before, during, and after raids. Interpreters marked damaged buildings, counted destroyed storage tanks, measured crater patterns, and assessed functional capacity based on visible activity. When repair work appeared, they noted it in reports that triggered follow-up raids. The system was ruthlessly efficient. Damage a plant, watch for repairs, bomb it again before restoration completed. By October 1944, the Medmenham files showed 87 of Germany's 91 synthetic fuel plants with red, destroyed or severely damaged classifications. Only 4 plants remained in partial operation, and those were targeted for immediate re-attack. The success of the oil campaign was known to Allied commanders planning their fall operations in Europe, which makes the surprise achieved by the Ardennes offensive even more puzzling in hindsight. Intelligence assessments from September 1944 explicitly stated that Germany had fuel for perhaps 2 to 3 months of reduced operations, and that projection assumed no major offensives. Allied planners knew that German synthetic fuel production had effectively ceased. They understood the Wehrmacht was critically short of petroleum. They possessed intercepts showing German units immobilized for lack of fuel, yet somehow the possibility that Germany would launch a major armoured offensive in December was dismissed as logistically impossible. The intelligence was perfect, the analysis was accurate, but the conclusion that Germany couldn't attack because they lacked fuel led to the assumption they wouldn't attack, and that assumption nearly proved fatal. By November 1944, as Hitler finalized plans for the Ardennes offensive, the Allied oil campaign had achieved exactly what Spaatz promised Eisenhower. In April, the Wehrmacht couldn't move. German fuel production stood at 5% of requirements. Reserves were nearly exhausted. Synthetic plants were wrecked beyond rapid repair. The petroleum pipeline from Romania was severed. Germany was fighting a modern mechanized war with less fuel than it needed for garrison duties, and now Hitler wanted to launch an offensive that would require more fuel than Germany had produced in the previous 2 months combined. The Americans had already won this battle before German tanks rolled toward the Belgian border. They had won it in the skies above Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer. The Ardennes offensive would be an exercise in watching mathematical certainty play out in snow and blood as German armour advanced, as far as empty fuel tanks would carry them, and not 1 mile farther. October 23rd, 1944, Wehrmacht Vehicle Testing Grounds, Kummersdorf. A Panther tank rolled to a sputtering halt after covering just 15 miles, its powerful Maybach engine coughing and dying despite a full fuel tank. Engineers clustered around the vehicle, shaking their heads with expressions mixing frustration and dark humor. This particular Panther had been modified with a wood gasification system, a bulky apparatus mounted on the rear deck that converted wood chips into combustible gas that could theoretically power the engine. In practice, the system added over 500 kilograms to the tank's weight, reduced engine power by 50%, cut operational range by 70%, and had just demonstrated its complete unsuitability for armoured warfare by breaking down in conditions far more benign than actual combat. This was Germany's fuel situation by late 1944, so desperate that serious military engineers were attempting to power main battle tanks with wood smoke. The German quest for fuel alternatives had accelerated throughout 1944 as synthetic fuel production collapsed and hope of conventional supplies vanished. The German military and civilian economy had experience with ersatz substitute materials used when the real thing wasn't available. Ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, ersatz rubber synthesized from coal. Ersatz everything as Allied blockades and bombing strangled Germany's access to conventional resources. But fuel was different. Engines designed for specific petroleum products couldn't simply accept random combustible substitutes without severe performance degradation or outright failure. Yet, desperation drove experimentation, and by autumn 1944, German researchers were testing fuel alternatives that ranged from the marginally plausible to the outright absurd. Wood gasification, or Holzgas, was actually a genuine pre-war technology that had seen limited civilian use during the Weimar era when fuel was expensive. The system worked by burning wood or charcoal in a sealed chamber with restricted oxygen, producing carbon monoxide and hydrogen gas that could be fed into a modified gasoline engine. Thousands of civilian vehicles in Germany ran on wood gas by 1944, puttering along at reduced speeds with their bulky gasifiers mounted on trailers or roof racks. But civilian cars doing 20 miles per hour on flat roads bore no resemblance to combat vehicles operating cross-country under fire. The Panther tank test at Kummersdorf was merely the most visible failure in a series of experiments that had already proven wood gas unsuitable for military vehicles, requiring speed, power, and reliability. Yet the research continued because the alternative, admitting Germany couldn't fuel its army, was unacceptable to Nazi leadership. In a chemical laboratory on the outskirts of Berlin, scientists worked under increasingly bizarre directives to create usable fuel from any available organic material. One team attempted to produce ethanol from potatoes, creating a fermentation and distillation process that theoretically could yield motor fuel. The problems were insurmountable. The energy required for distillation exceeded the energy content of the resulting fuel. The process demanded food calories that Germans needed to eat, and the resulting ethanol corroded fuel systems designed for petroleum products. Another group experimented with coal dust slurries mixed with water and additives, hoping to create a pumpable liquid fuel that could bypass the complex catalytic processes of synthetic fuel plants. The slurries clogged fuel filters, damaged injection pumps, and left engines coated in carbon deposits that destroyed them within hours. Each experiment failed. Each failure prompted a new directive for more exotic research, and the cycle continued while conventional fuel supplies evaporated. The Luftwaffe faced perhaps the most acute version of this crisis. Fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 required high-octane aviation gasoline, typically 96 to 100 octane rating, to achieve the performance necessary for combat. Lower-grade fuel caused engine knock, reduced power, and could lead to catastrophic engine failure during combat maneuvers. By November 1944, Germany's aviation fuel production had collapsed even more completely than ground vehicle fuel, and the Luftwaffe began experimenting with desperate alternatives. Some units mixed methanol with low-grade gasoline, creating MSTOF that theoretically boosted octane but in practice corroded fuel lines and caused engine seizures. Other units attempted to run fighters on modified diesel fuel, achieving predictably disastrous results. Hundreds of German fighters sat grounded not because they were damaged but because no suitable fuel existed to fly them. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, wrote to Goering in November 1944 with a blunt assessment. "We have tested 37 fuel alternatives since August. None are viable for aviation operations. Most are dangerous. Several have killed test pilots. Unless conventional fuel production is restored immediately, the Luftwaffe will cease to exist as an effective force by January. The memo went unanswered. Hitler had already committed to the Ardennes offensive, and any suggestion that fuel shortages made the operation impossible was treated as defeatist thinking. The research into ersatz fuels continued because stopping would mean acknowledging reality, and the Nazi regime had passed the point where it could function in reality. The most tragic aspect of these alternative fuel experiments was the resources they consumed. Scientists who could have contributed to genuinely useful research were instead directed to investigate impossible fuel substitutes. Manufacturing capacity that might have produced ammunition, vehicles, or other war materials was instead devoted to building wood gasification systems and experimental fuel processes. Testing grounds were tied up running trials of fuels that had no practical application. The entire effort represented Germany's descent into a surreal denial of basic chemistry and physics, where political will was expected to overcome thermodynamic impossibility. You couldn't power a Panther tank with wood gas, no matter how much the leadership wished otherwise. You couldn't run a Bf109 on potato alcohol, regardless of how desperately you needed aviation fuel. But acknowledging these truths would require acknowledging that Germany had lost the war, and that acknowledgement remained impossible. By early December, as divisions assembled for the Ardennes offensive, the fuel quality problem added another layer of crisis to the fundamental supply shortage. Even the limited fuel allocations units received were of questionable quality: diesel fuel mixed with low-grade substitutes, gasoline cut with benzene and additives, aviation fuel that barely met minimum octane requirements. Vehicles that did receive fuel often experienced engine problems, increased consumption, and mechanical failures attributable not to lack of maintenance but to fuel that German engines weren't designed to burn. The quartermaster reports from this period read like chronicles of cascading failure. Trucks breaking down not from wear but from fuel system corrosion, tanks experiencing power loss from inferior diesel, half-tracks immobilized by clogged fuel filters that needed cleaning every few miles. In a November 28th memo that was immediately classified and hidden from Hitler, the Wehrmacht Quartermaster General compiled a summary of alternative fuel testing results. The document was remarkable for its bitter honesty. Wood gasification, unsuitable for military vehicles. Methanol blends, destroy fuel systems. Potato alcohol, requires more calories to produce than available. Coal dust slurries, catastrophically unreliable. Lower-grade diesel substitutes, reduce engine performance by 30 to 40% and increase fuel consumption by similar amounts. The memo's conclusion was unavoidable. No viable fuel alternatives exist for large-scale military operations. The offensive, scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, would have to run on the inadequate supplies of compromised quality conventional fuel that remained in German stockpiles, and when those supplies ran out, the offensive would stop. There were no substitutes, there was no ersatz solution, there was only the mathematics of empty tanks. The supreme irony was that Germany possessed some of the world's most advanced engines and vehicles, technological marvels that represented decades of engineering innovation, and these sophisticated machines required precisely the high-quality fuel that Germany could no longer produce. American and Soviet vehicles, often derided by German tankers as crude and unsophisticated, were designed with wider tolerances and could operate on lower-grade fuel without catastrophic problems. German tanks, aircraft, and vehicles were optimized for performance, which meant optimized for fuel that no longer existed. The Third Reich had built a military force that was literally too advanced for its collapsing industrial base to sustain. Every Panther, every Tiger, every Bf109 was a masterpiece of engineering that sat immobilized, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was too well designed for fuel that had gone up in smoke over Luna and Perlitz. The desperate search for alternative fuels was really a search for alternatives to admitting defeat, and such alternatives didn't exist in any laboratory or testing ground in the shattered Reich. November 10th, 1944, OKW Logistics Center, Zossen. 2 Wehrmacht colonels stood nearly face-to-face across a plotting table, voices rising, fingers stabbing at maps with barely controlled aggression. Colonel Heinrich Draeger represented 6th Panzer Army Logistics, demanding priority fuel allocation for SS divisions, preparing to spearhead the Ardennes offensive. Colonel Werner Kreipp represented 5th Panzer Army, arguing that his more experienced commanders could use limited fuel more effectively than Dietrich's politically favoured SS units. Within minutes, The argument had escalated to personal insults. Within 10 minutes, staff officers separated the two men before the confrontation became physical. This was Germany in November 1944, fighting a multi-front war against enemies on every side, while its own logistics officers fought each other over drops of fuel that didn't exist in sufficient quantities for any of them. The allocation crisis stemmed from a fundamental impossibility. Germany's total remaining fuel reserves in early November stood at approximately 1.2 million gallons, barely enough for 3 days of normal Wehrmacht operations across all fronts, and less than 30% of what the Ardennes offensive required. Distributing these inadequate supplies required choices that would determine which units operated and which sat immobilized, which attacks proceeded and which were cancelled, which commanders would receive the means to fight, and which would watch their forces wither from petroleum starvation. The decision-making process became political in the worst sense, with personal relationships, party connections, and institutional rivalries determining allocation more than tactical necessity or operational competence. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army received priority designation, which meant 50% of available fuel stocks despite comprising only 40% of the offensive's combat strength. Dietrich was an old Nazi, one of Hitler's original bodyguards from the early party days, lacking formal military education but possessing unquestioned political loyalty. His SS divisions enjoyed preferential treatment in every aspect of supply and equipment, and fuel was no exception. Hitler personally directed that 6th Panzer Army would receive first priority for fuel allocations, essentially starving other formations to feed Dietrich's politically favoured force. The decision was militarily indefensible. Dietrich had shown little talent for armoured operations, but politically inevitable. In a regime where party loyalty trumped professional competence, 5th Panzer Army under Hasse von Manteuffel received second priority allocation of 30% of available stocks. Manteuffel was everything. Dietrich wasn't. A professional soldier from minor Prussian nobility, a skilled tactician with extensive Eastern Front experience, and a commander respected by his troops and feared by his enemies. But Manteuffel wasn't SS, wasn't an old Nazi, and didn't have Hitler's personal favour. His divisions would fight on starvation fuel rations while less competent SS formations received comparative abundance. The injustice was obvious to everyone except Hitler, and Hitler's opinion was the only one that mattered. Even the 30% allocation was generous by Wehrmacht standards. 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger would receive just 15% of fuel stocks despite being responsible for protecting the entire southern flank of the offensive. The SS-Wehrmacht rivalry over fuel allocation was merely the most visible manifestation of deeper institutional fractures tearing the German military apart. The Waffen-SS had evolved from Hitler's party militia into a parallel military force with its own divisions, equipment priorities, and supply chains. SS units generally received newer tanks, more ammunition, better provisions, and now more fuel than equivalent Wehrmacht formations, regardless of tactical necessity. Wehrmacht officers watched SS units requisition scarce fuel while their own divisions sat immobilized, breeding resentment that undermined the unity essential for complex offensive operations. Staff officers who protested the allocation disparity were reminded that the Führer's decision was final, and questioning it bordered on defeatism. The allocation chaos extended beyond inter-service rivalry into outright corruption and black market activity. In mid-November, a fuel audit of forward depot inventories revealed a shocking discrepancy. Records showed 200,000 gallons stored at various locations, but physical inspection found only 120,000 gallons actually present. 80,000 gallons had simply vanished, siphoned off by black marketeers, stolen by civilians desperate for heating fuel, or embezzled by corrupt supply officers and sold for personal profit. 1 gallon of gasoline on the German black market in November 1944 could be traded for a gold watch or a month's salary in increasingly worthless Reichsmarks. The temptation was enormous. The opportunity was abundant. The discipline and oversight needed to prevent theft were luxuries Germany no longer possessed. Division commanders responded to the allocation crisis by hoarding whatever fuel they received, trusting no promises of future supply and assuming that higher headquarters would sacrifice their units to preserve others. 2nd Panzer Division concealed approximately 30,000 gallons in camouflaged dumps scattered across their assembly area, quantities they didn't report in official inventories and wouldn't share with other formations under any circumstances. Panzer Lehr did the same. 1st SS Panzer Division, 12th SS Panzer Division. Each major formation created secret fuel reserves because experience had taught that written allocation orders bore no relationship to actual delivery. The hoarding meant that even the inadequate fuel supplies Germany possessed weren't efficiently distributed, with some units hiding surplus while others genuinely operated on fumes. Lower-level units faced even more acute allocation problems. A typical panzer battalion in November 1944 required approximately 20,000 gallons for 1 week of moderate operations. The actual allocation such units received varied from 2,000 to 8,000 gallons, enough for 1 to 3 days of limited movement, insufficient for sustained operations, totally inadequate for the mobile warfare doctrine German armor was designed to execute. Company commanders learned to watch their fuel gauges more intently than enemy positions, calculating every movement in terms of fuel consumption, rationing diesel and gasoline like precious jewels because there would be no resupply once initial allocations were exhausted. Training ceased. Reconnaissance patrols were cancelled. Even tactical repositioning was deferred because every gallon burn maneuvering was a gallon unavailable for combat. The Eastern Front telegrams, flooding into OKW throughout November, painted a picture of nearly complete immobilization. Army Group Center reported panzer divisions unable to conduct counterattacks because they lacked fuel to move from defensive positions. Army Group South requested fuel allocation for even minimal operations, explaining that their divisions were effectively static fortifications because no diesel was available for armoured vehicles. Army Group North's situation was even more desperate. Units there hadn't received meaningful fuel allocation since September and were conserving their final reserves for a potential evacuation that would require every drop to move vehicles to ports. The responses to these pleas were uniform: no fuel available. All reserves committed to the Western Front offensive. Hold positions with available resources. The Eastern Front was being stripped of its last fuel to enable an operation in the West that would consume everything and achieve nothing. The bitterest irony of the allocation wars was that the fuel being so desperately fought over was largely fantasy. The 1.2 million gallons supposedly available in November included stocks that existed only on paper, fuel allocated but not yet delivered, fuel promised but not yet produced, fuel listed in depot inventories but already consumed or stolen. The actual physically available fuel was perhaps 800,000 gallons, 2/3 of what records claimed, and even that amount was scattered across dozens of depots and storage sites, much of it in the wrong locations, some of it low quality, all of it insufficient. German logistics officers were fighting over the distribution of supplies that couldn't support the operation, even if divided with perfect efficiency and distributed without loss. The allocation wars were arguments about how to divide zero by multiple claimants, with the inevitable answer being that everyone would receive nothing. By late November, as divisions completed their movements to assembly areas, the fuel allocation situation had resolved into grim reality. 6th Panzer Army had approximately 60% of the fuel needed for its initial operational phase. 5th Panzer Army had 45%, 7th Army had 30%. No formation had full fuel loads. No commander had confidence in resupply. No planner believed the allocations were adequate. But the offensive was scheduled to launch on December 16th, regardless of fuel status, because in Nazi Germany, operational decisions were made by Hitler's will rather than logistical reality. The allocation wars had distributed inadequate fuel in politically determined proportions, creating an offensive that would stall not from enemy action but from simple arithmetic. The tanks would advance until the fuel ran out, and then they would stop, and there was nothing further that any allocation system or argument between colonels could do about it. November 22nd, 1944, Army Group B Headquarters, Ziegenberg, Field Marshal Walter Model's Chief of Staff, opened the operation safe and withdrew 2 folders, both marked Wacht am Rhein, both containing fuel calculations for the upcoming offensive. One folder, painted in optimistic assumptions and best-case scenarios, showed fuel requirements barely met through captured Allied depots and promised German reserves. This was the version briefed to Hitler. The second folder, locked in the safe and shown to no one outside Model's inner circle, contained realistic calculations showing that available fuel would carry the offensive perhaps 50 kilometers before complete paralysis. The Chief of Staff studied both documents with an expression of profound moral exhaustion. He was preparing an operation he knew would fail, serving a regime that refused to acknowledge reality executing orders that would waste Germany's last reserves in a doomed attack. This was the planner's dilemma. Professional competence in service of strategic insanity. The German military planning system was built on generations of staff officer tradition, emphasizing thoroughness, mathematical precision, and brutal honesty about capabilities and limitations. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder had established the principle that staff planning should reflect reality rather than wishful thinking, that operational orders must align with logistical possibilities, and that lying to commanders about supply situations was professional malpractice that got soldiers killed. By November 1944, that tradition had been systematically destroyed by a political leadership that demanded plans conforming to desired outcomes rather than physical possibility. Staff officers found themselves creating two sets of plans, the fantasy versions showing success and the realistic versions predicting failure. The gap between these documents measured the Third Reich's descent into collective madness. The fuel planning for the Ardennes offensive required remarkable intellectual gymnastics to create even the pretense of feasibility. The operational objective, capturing Antwerp in 7 days over 125 miles of difficult terrain, demanded fuel consumption models that German planners understood precisely. 6th Panzer Army would consume approximately 2.5 million gallons. 5th Panzer Army would need 1.5 million gallons. 7th Army and supporting units another 500,000 gallons. The total minimum requirement was 4.5 million gallons for the initial phase, before considering resupply for exploitation operations or defensive consolidation. Against this requirement stood actual fuel allocation, 1.2 million gallons in forward depots, with another 500,000 gallons potentially deliverable during the offensive's first week. The deficit was 3 million gallons, a shortage so enormous that any junior quartermaster could recognize the operation as impossible. The solution planners devised was the captured fuel assumption, a logical fiction that transformed the impossible into the theoretically plausible through magical thinking. German intelligence had identified 14 major American fuel depot locations between the start line and the Meuse River. Reconnaissance and interrogations suggested these depots contained between 3 and 5 million gallons of fuel. This was doing tremendous weight-bearing work in the planning documents if German forces captured these depots quickly, if American engineers failed to destroy them, if the captured fuel was compatible with German vehicles, if it could be immediately distributed to advancing units, then the offensive's fuel requirements could theoretically be met through enemy supplies. The plan was essentially this: start with insufficient fuel, advance until nearly empty, capture enemy fuel depots, continue advancing on captured fuel, reach Antwerp. It was strategy written by optimists who had forgotten that war tends to punish optimism with death. General Husso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, understood the fuel planning fiction better than most. In a November conference with his staff, speaking with the unguarded honesty possible only in private, he laid out the real situation. "We have fuel for 50 kilometers," he told his assembled commanders. "After that, we walk." The entire operational plan depends on capturing American fuel depots intact within 48 hours. If we don't capture them, or if they're destroyed, the offensive stops wherever we happen to be when the tanks run dry. There is no reserve, there is no fallback, there is just hope that we can steal enough fuel from the Americans to keep moving. He paused, letting the words settle. "I have been a soldier for 25 years. I have never planned an operation where success required stealing supplies from the enemy. We are about to conduct the largest German offensive since 1941, and our primary logistics plan is highway robbery." The route selection process revealed how completely fuel-dominated operational planning. 6th Panzer Army's advance routes through the northern sector were chosen not primarily for tactical advantage, but for proximity to suspected American fuel depots. Kampfgruppe Peiper's route toward Stavelot was selected partially because intelligence placed a major fuel depot near that town. 2nd Panzer Division's axis through the center aimed toward areas where American supply concentrations were believed to exist. The operational planning had inverted. Instead of choosing routes to achieve tactical objectives with logistics supporting those choices, planners were choosing routes to find fuel with tactical objectives hopefully achievable along the way. It was strategy subordinated to supply, warfare as scavenger hunt, armoured operations designed around ransacking enemy logistics. The planning documents revealed another uncomfortable truth. German staff officers had calculated the offensive's culminating point, the distance at which combat power declined below levels needed to continue operations at roughly 40 miles, not the 125 miles to Antwerp. Clausewitz had defined the culminating point as the moment when attacking forces had exhausted their offensive potential and became vulnerable to counterattack. German planners in November 1944 had a more precise definition. The culminating point was wherever the fuel ran out. Fritz Kramer, Sepp Dietrich's chief of staff, privately marked his maps showing 6th Panzer Army stalling at the Meuse River crossings, perhaps 40 miles into the offensive. He didn't expect to reach Antwerp, he hoped to reach the Meuse. Even that limited objective would require captured fuel to achieve. The planning process included virtually no contingency for failure to capture Allied depots. When junior officers asked what would happen if the Americans destroyed their fuel stocks before German forces arrived, they received vague assurances that speed and surprise would prevent demolition. When they inquired about alternative fuel sources if captured depots proved insufficient, they were told to assume success. When they raised concerns about coordination between capture and distribution of seized supplies, they were assured that local initiative would solve problems. The plan had no plan B, because having a plan B would require acknowledging that plan A was built on fantasy, and that acknowledgement would require cancelling an offensive Hitler had personally ordered. So planning continued, documents were produced, movement tables were finalised, and everyone involved understood they were preparing an operation whose failure was mathematically inevitable. The most tragic planning failures involved failure to scale ambitions to available resources, a German offensive in the West with realistic objectives, limited scope, and fuel calculations based on actual supplies rather than hoped-for captures might have achieved meaningful tactical success. Manteuffel privately sketched such an operation, a 40-mile penetration to the Meuse River, followed by defensive consolidation, drawing American forces into costly counterattacks. Such an operation would have required perhaps 1.5 million gallons of fuel, still more than immediately available, but within the range of possibility, with strict fuel discipline and moderate success. But Hitler didn't want limited tactical success. He wanted Antwerp. He wanted to split the Allied armies. He wanted miracle of 1940. And so the planning continued toward an impossible objective with impossible fuel requirements, professional soldiers creating detailed operations orders for strategic fantasy. By late November, as planning finalized and divisions received their operations orders, many German officers had made private peace with knowing they were executing a doomed offensive. Some justified their participation as duty to subordinates better, to plan competently, even for a failed operation, than to plan poorly and make disaster worse. Others rationalized it as obedience to authority, the traditional German military virtue that didn't permit questioning orders from lawful superiors. A few still believed in the possibility of success, or at least the necessity of trying. But across Army Group B headquarters, an atmosphere of profound pessimism prevailed. The planners knew. They had done the mathematics. They understood what empty fuel tanks meant for armoured divisions. They were watching the Third Reich commit suicide with meticulous staff work, detailed movement orders, and professionally formatted operations plans that described strategic impossibility with tactical precision. December 10th, 1944, assembly area near Prüm, Germany. 50 Panther tanks of 2nd Panzer Division sat silent in a snow-covered forest clearing, not because their crews were resting, but because the division had run out of fuel. Each Panther needed to move approximately 60 miles to reach its jump-off position for the offensive scheduled to begin in 6 days. Each Panther's fuel tanks held 190 gallons when full, giving a theoretical range of 90 miles on roads, barely sufficient for the movement, with nothing left for combat. But the Panthers weren't full. They had received half allocations, 95 gallons per vehicle, enough for perhaps 45 miles, under ideal conditions. The mathematics was impossible. The solution was medieval. Half-tracks would tow the Panthers to conserve fuel, and tank crews would walk alongside their vehicles through freezing rain and snow, arriving at the start line already exhausted, already demoralized, already defeated before firing a shot. The pre-offensive movement phase revealed fuel poverty more starkly than any planning document. Between December 5th and December 15th, 3 German armies, totaling over 250,000 men and 1,400 armoured vehicles, attempted to concentrate in the Eifel region along the Belgian border. The movement had to occur primarily at night to avoid Allied aerial reconnaissance, which meant vehicles running without lights on icy forest roads, navigation by compass and whispered directions, columns stretching for miles with no communication between units. Under optimal conditions, such movements consumed fuel at standard rates. Under the actual conditions of December 1944 nighttime movement, sub-zero temperatures, icy roads, blackout conditions, fuel consumption increased by 30 to 40% as vehicles idled, engines required extended warm-up periods, and drivers used excessive throttle to maintain traction. Feldwebel Ernst Bachmann, a Panzer ace commanding a Panther in 4th Panzer Division, recorded the movement in his personal diary with mounting disbelief. December 11th, received 40 gallons of fuel for movement to assembly area, need 80, told this is all that's available. December 12th, moved 20 miles last night, burned 38 gallons. Have 2 gallons remaining plus emergency reserve. How are we supposed to attack? December 13th, no fuel received. Tank hasn't moved in 24 hours. They say the great offensive begins in 3 days. We can't start the engine. December 14th, received 15 gallons, not enough to reach start line, much less fight. Bachmann's diary entries tracked the collapse of German logistics in real time, each notation marking another impossible calculation, another commander's promise broken, another expectation reduced to bitter reality. The fuel distribution system collapsed under the pre-offensive strain. Every night, fuel trucks attempted to reach forward assembly areas, navigating bombed roads and collapsed bridges, subject to occasional Allied air attacks, despite darkness, racing against time to deliver supplies before the offensive launched. The trucks consumed fuel to deliver fuel, and the distances were long, the roads were terrible, and the margin between delivery and consumption had vanished. A fuel truck carrying 5,000 gallons might burn 500 gallons in a round trip to forward depots, meaning 10% of every delivery was consumed by the delivery system itself. Multiply that across hundreds of trucks making dozens of runs, and the inefficiency became catastrophic. Germany was burning fuel to deliver fuel to units that would burn that fuel, moving to positions where they would have no fuel for actual combat. December 13th, 1944, a fuel distribution point near Prüm witnessed the surreal spectacle of German officers physically fighting over fuel truck contents. 6 Panzer Army representatives arrived with orders giving them priority for the truck's entire load. 5th Panzer Army representatives arrived with different orders claiming priority. The truck driver, a 52-year-old sergeant who had fought in the First World War, sat in his cab watching colonels screaming at each other, shoving and eventually coming to blows before military police intervened. The scene repeated at distribution points across the concentration area. Units with insufficient fuel, fighting other units with insufficient fuel for allocations that were insufficient for anyone. The distribution system had devolved into chaos where rank, connections, and physical assertiveness determined who received fuel rather than operational necessity. Weather conditions made every aspect of the movement more difficult and more fuel-intensive. Temperatures in the Eifel region dropped to 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in early December, cold enough that diesel fuel began gelling, forming wax crystals that clogged fuel filters and injection systems. Crews learned to light fires beneath fuel tanks to liquefy the diesel before attempting to start engines, a process that consumed time, risked vehicle fires, and wasted precious fuel. Gasoline engines required extended warm-up periods before operating efficiently in such cold, meaning vehicles burned fuel while stationary. Half-tracks and trucks carrying infantry and supplies struggled on icy roads, spinning wheels, and burning excessive fuel to maintain even modest speeds. Every kilometre of movement consumed more fuel than planners had calculated, and the calculations had already been too optimistic. The mechanical breakdown rate during pre-offensive movement approached 20% for some formations, with many failures attributable to fuel system problems. Tanks that had sat immobile for weeks suddenly required movement without proper maintenance, and cold weather stressed every component. Fuel pumps failed, fuel lines cracked, fuel filters clogged with particles and water contamination. Engines that successfully started often ran roughly on the low-quality fuel available, producing visible smoke and consuming fuel at elevated rates. Recovery vehicles attempting to tow disabled tanks back to repair facilities often ran out of fuel themselves, creating chains of immobilized vehicles blocking narrow forest roads. The 2nd Panzer Division reported 43 Panthers non-operational on December 14-15 from combat damage sustained in previous operations, 28 from mechanical failures during pre-offensive movement, most of those from fuel system problems. By December 15th, the day before the offensive was scheduled to launch, fuel status across Army Group B was catastrophically worse than operational plans assumed. 6th Panzer Army had approximately 60% of the fuel needed for the initial phase of operations, and that calculation included the fuel burned getting to the start line, meaning tanks were already partially depleted before the attack began. 5th Panzer Army stood at 45% of fuel requirement, some divisions far worse. 7th Army had received barely 30% of its allocation, making it effectively a static defensive force rather than a mobile army. Across the concentration areas, hundreds of tanks sat silent, their crews performing final maintenance, checking ammunition loads, studying maps, and staring at fuel gauges that read 1/4 full, half full if lucky, sometimes nearly empty. The final fuel deliveries arrived on December 15th and into the early morning hours of December 16th, sometimes reaching units just hours before jump-off time. Distribution was hasty, documentation was sloppy, and verification was impossible. Some units received their full allocation, such as it was. Others received partial delivery. A few received nothing and had to beg, borrow, or steal fuel from neighbouring formations. Kampfgruppe Peiper, designated as 6th Panzer Army's spearhead and tasked with the deepest penetration, received its fuel allocation on the afternoon of December 15th. The unit's supply officer calculated that with strict fuel discipline, they had enough for approximately 90 kilometres of movement. Their objective, the Meuse River bridges near Huy, was 97 kilometres distant, 7 kilometres short. Before considering combat, consumption, manoeuvring, or contingencies, the best equipped, highest priority spearhead of Germany's last great offensive would begin the attack, already lacking sufficient fuel to reach its objective. December 15th evening, across dozens of frozen assembly areas in the Eifel forests, tank commanders conducted final crew briefings. They explained the operational plan, showed maps, marking routes and objectives, described enemy positions and friendly support. But many briefings ended with uncomfortable honesty about the fuel situation. Company commanders told their crews, "We have enough to advance, not enough to retreat." Battalion commanders explained, "Resupply depends on capturing American fuel depots." Regimental commanders admitted, "If we don't capture fuel in the first 2 days, the offensive stalls wherever we stop." The troops understood. They weren't stupid. They had watched their fuel gauges during the movement to the start line. They knew the tanks would advance until empty and then stop. And whether that happened after 50 kilometres or 100 kilometres or 50 metres depended on combat conditions, terrain, and luck. They were about to attack in some of the most sophisticated armoured vehicles ever built, marvels of German engineering, and those marvels would transform into immobile steel coffins the moment their fuel tanks read empty. The pre-offensive crawl had consumed between 400,000 and 600,000 gallons of fuel, roughly 13 to 18% of total offensive allocation burned before the first shot was fired. The effect was devastating. Units arrived at start positions with partially depleted tanks, no reserve fuel for unexpected delays or combat consumption, and absolute dependence on capturing Allied supplies within 48 hours. The offensive would begin not with the shock of fresh, fully fueled divisions smashing into surprise defenders, but with partially exhausted formations already operating on razor-thin fuel margins, advancing not toward tactical objectives but toward American fuel depots they hoped existed, hoped weren't destroyed, hoped could be captured intact, hoped would contain compatible fuel. It was desperation disguised as operational planning, and every soldier watching fuel gauges on the night of December 15th understood that they were participating in Germany's last throw of the dice, with loaded dice that had already come up empty. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, Belgian-German border. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front, their muzzle flashes illuminating the pre-dawn darkness like a horizontal lightning storm. American soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division, many of them recent replacements who had never experienced combat, jolted awake to the sound of incoming shells shredding forests and exploding among their positions. For 30 minutes, the artillery barrage continued with an intensity the Western Front hadn't witnessed since 1940. Then silence. Then the rumble of tank engines. Then the appearance of German infantry emerging from the morning fog. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. But behind the thunder and shock, behind the advancing infantry and the supporting armour, Kampfgruppe Peiper's supply officer was already radioing headquarters with an urgent message: "Need fuel immediately. Cannot proceed without resupply." It was 6 hours into the offensive, and the fuel crisis had already begun. 6th Panzer Army jumped off first, designated as the main effort that would drive northwest toward the Meuse River crossings and ultimately Antwerp. Sepp Dietrich's divisions had received 55 to 60% of their fuel requirement during the pre-offensive phase, which meant his tanks began the attack with partially filled fuel tanks and no significant reserves. 1st SS Panzer Division, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Peiper, crossed the start line at 6:15 a.m. after the artillery preparation lifted. The Kampfgruppe consisted of approximately 100 tanks, Panthers, Tiger IIs, and Panzer IVs, along with 5,000 SS Panzer Grenadiers mounted in half-tracks and trucks. Their fuel status at jump-off, sufficient for approximately 50 miles of road movement under ideal conditions. Their objective? Meuse River bridges near Huy, 97 miles distant. The mathematics hadn't improved overnight. The initial advance stalled almost immediately, not from American resistance, but from fuel-induced traffic chaos behind German lines. The narrow forest roads of the Eifel region funneled multiple divisions through limited routes, creating massive traffic jams as fuel-starved vehicles broke down and blocked entire columns. 12th SS Panzer Division, attempting to follow 1st SS Panzer Division toward the breakthrough corridor, found its lead battalion immobilized by noon on December 16th when advance elements ran out of fuel after just 10 miles. The battalion sat stationary, blocking the division behind it, which blocked the corps reserves behind that. Peiper, racing ahead with his Kampfgruppe, radioed back increasingly frustrated messages: "Road blocked by immobilized vehicles, cannot detour," and delayed 6 hours. The offensive's first day was supposed to reach objectives 20 to 30 miles into Belgium. Peiper was still in Germany, trapped behind traffic jams created by vehicles that had run dry. 5th Panzer Army, jumping off in the center sector, initially achieved better progress, partly because Manteuffel had positioned his forces more efficiently, and partly because he was operating with lower fuel expectations. 2nd Panzer Division and Panzerlehr Division both achieved penetrations of 5 to 8 miles on December 16th, overrunning surprised American positions and creating localized crises along the thinly held front, but even these successes revealed the fuel crisis. 2nd Panzer Division's advance stalled by evening when its lead battalion ran critically low on fuel and had to pause for resupply that didn't arrive. Panzerlehr captured the town of Marnach but couldn't exploit the breakthrough because follow-on units lacked fuel to advance. The successes were real but incomplete tactical victories that couldn't be developed into operational breakthroughs because the fuel to sustain exploitation didn't exist. The first captured American fuel came at Bullingen, where Kampfgruppe Peiper overran a US supply depot at approximately 2 p.m. on December 17th, the offensive's second day. But worth discussing here for context, the Germans captured approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline, a significant quantity that should have provided meaningful relief to Peiper's fuel crisis. The problems emerged immediately. The fuel was gasoline, and many of Peiper's vehicles, particularly the diesel-powered Panthers and Tiger IIs, couldn't use it without engine damage. The gasoline could fuel the half-tracks and trucks, but the tanks that most needed resupply received no benefit. Peiper's engineers jerry-rigged filtration systems attempting to make the gasoline usable in diesel engines, but the compatibility problems were fundamental chemistry, not engineering challenges. The Kampfgruppe had captured fuel they largely couldn't use, a perfect metaphor for the entire offensive's futility. By December 16th evening, as commanders assessed the day's results, the fuel situation was already critical across the offensive zone. 6th Panzer Army had advanced 5 to 12 miles at various points but had consumed approximately 250,000 gallons of fuel, roughly 21% of its total offensive allocation for gains that averaged perhaps 8 miles. At that consumption rate, available fuel would support 3 more days of operations before complete exhaustion, and that calculation assumed no increase in consumption rates despite increasing combat intensity. 5th Panzer Army had achieved slightly deeper penetrations with better fuel efficiency, but Manteuffel's units had started with less fuel and had nothing approaching adequate reserves. 7th Army in the south had barely advanced at all, its infantry divisions making limited progress, but the fuel-starved armour providing minimal support. The operational planning had called for December 16th to reach the Meuse River, or at least advance 30 miles toward that objective. The actual results: 8 miles average penetration, 1,400 American prisoners captured, some tactical successes, and a fuel situation that had deteriorated from critical to catastrophic. 1st SS Panzer Division, the designated spearhead, remained largely immobilized by traffic jams and fuel shortages, still stuck in Germany while the operational timeline ticked away. 2nd Panzer Division had reached Clairvaux in Luxembourg but sat waiting for fuel to continue. Panzerlehr held Marnach but couldn't advance. Across the offensive zone, German armour had demonstrated it could still shock American defenders and achieve breakthroughs when properly employed. But the armour couldn't sustain advances. It couldn't exploit success. It couldn't maintain momentum. Because every tank that moved forward was burning fuel from reserves that couldn't be replaced. The American reaction on December 16th was confusion and delay rather than coordinated defence, which paradoxically made the German fuel crisis worse. Scattered American units fought desperately in isolated positions, forcing German armour to manoeuvre repeatedly, burn fuel repositioning for attacks, idle engines while awaiting infantry to clear positions. If American forces had simply withdrawn immediately, German armour might have advanced more fuel efficiently in pursuit. Instead, the patchwork American defence forced German tanks to fight for every kilometre, consuming fuel through combat manoeuvres that planning calculations hadn't fully accounted for. By evening, Manteuffel was reporting to Model that his advance elements were manoeuvring 3 to 4 times as much as anticipated, burning fuel at rates 20 to 30% higher than planned. The operational timeline was already broken. The fuel consumption rate was already unsustainable. And the offensive was less than 16 hours old. The radio intercepts captured by Allied signals intelligence on December 16th told the story more clearly than German commanders wanted to admit. American monitoring stations listening to German tactical communications heard repeated requests for fuel throughout the day. Require immediate fuel resupply. Cannot advance without fuel allocation. Request fuel priority. The messages repeated with increasing urgency as the day progressed. Allied intelligence officers, still not certain whether this was a major offensive or a limited spoiling attack, noted the fuel-related communications with interest. By December 17th, intelligence assessments were identifying fuel shortage as a significant German vulnerability. But American commanders weren't yet positioned to exploit that vulnerability because they were still reacting to the shock of the German attack itself. December 16th ended with Germany having achieved tactical surprise, local breakthroughs, and approximately 8 miles of average penetration. These were real accomplishments against an enemy caught off guard and thinly deployed. But the day also ended with approximately 250,000 gallons of fuel consumed, 15 to 20% of German armour already immobilized from fuel exhaustion, American fuel depots still uncaptured, and operational objectives nowhere near achieved. The offensive had been planned to reach the Meuse River within 3 to 4 days. After 1 day, German forces were still 60 to 70 miles short of that river, having consumed fuel at rates that would allow perhaps 3 more days of operations at most. The mathematics of failure were already writing themselves across the snowy Belgian landscape, in trails of abandoned vehicles, empty fuel cans, and tanks sitting motionless not because they were destroyed but because their fuel gauges read empty. December 17, 1944, 9 a.m., Army Group B headquarters. Field Marshal Model stood before a large operations map, watching red pins marking German advance positions being updated by staff officers. The pins showed penetrations of 12 to 18 miles, at the deepest points better than December 16th, but still far short of operational requirements. Then Model turned to the fuel situation map on the adjacent board, and his expression darkened. 40% of German armoured vehicles were now reporting critical fuel shortages, some units down to their final reserves, most units requesting immediate resupply that headquarters couldn't provide. Model had commanded armies on the Eastern Front where desperate situations were routine, but this was different. His forces weren't losing to enemy action, they were bleeding out through their fuel lines, hemorrhaging mobility with every kilometre advanced. By evening December 17th, Model would send a message to OKW that his superiors would ignore. Without immediate fuel resupply of at least 200,000 litres, the offensive stops within 48 hours. December 17th brought the offensive's most significant tactical successes alongside accelerating fuel crisis. Kampfgruppe Peiper finally breaking free of traffic jams, advanced approximately 35 miles in a dramatic thrust that took it deeper into Belgium than any other German unit. The 2nd Panzer Division achieved a breakthrough near Clairvaux and advanced toward Bastogne, creating operational opportunities that looked significant on maps. In the north, units of 6th Panzer Army penetrated American defensive lines at multiple points. But every success consumed fuel at rates that made the successes unsustainable. Peiper's dramatic advance burned through most of his remaining diesel, leaving his Kampfgruppe with perhaps 20 kilometers of range and desperately seeking the American fuel depots intelligence had promised existed along his route. The 2nd Panzer Division achieved its breakthrough by concentrating every available drop of fuel in its lead elements, effectively robbing fuel from support units and follow-on battalions. Company Commander Rolf Müncheberg later described the decision: "We took fuel from every vehicle we could, trucks, half-tracks, even recovery vehicles. We filled the lead Panthers to capacity and sent them forward with orders to advance until they ran dry. The rest of the battalion would follow on foot if necessary." The tactic worked tactically. 2nd Panzer's spearhead reached Longville by December 18th, but the fuel cannibalization meant that 2/3 of the division's vehicles sat immobilized in the rear, unable to support the advance, unable to consolidate gains, unable to provide the depth an armoured division needed to sustain operations. December 18th brought the realization that fuel shortage was transforming from critical problem to existential crisis. Across the offensive zone, German commanders faced identical dilemmas. Advance units were running dry, support echelons lacked fuel to move forward, and American resistance was stiffening as reinforcements arrived. Radio traffic intercepted by American signals intelligence recorded increasing desperation. "Require fuel immediately or must halt. Cannot continue without resupply. Request permission to consolidate position until fuel arrives." The messages came from battalion commanders, regimental commanders, division commanders, each reporting the same impossible situation. They had advanced beyond their fuel range and were now immobilized, waiting for resupply that wasn't coming. The fuel consumption rates during December 17th and 18th reached approximately 350,000 gallons, 29% of total remaining offensive allocation. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. If consumption continued at this rate, total fuel exhaustion would occur by December 21st, regardless of tactical successes or operational objectives. German planning had assumed approximately 6 to 7 days of operations to reach the Meuse River. With fuel consumption rates running well above planned levels and available fuel running well below planned quantities, the actual operational endurance was perhaps 4 to 5 days. The offensive was eating itself, consuming its limited resources faster than any success could justify, advancing into a dead end measured in empty fuel tanks. By December 18th evening, approximately 30 to 35% of German armour was completely immobilized from fuel exhaustion, not counting the additional vehicles that were critically low. Panzer Lehr reported 23 tanks abandoned for lack of fuel. 9th Panzer Division reported an entire battalion stationary awaiting fuel delivery. 116th Panzer Division informed Corps headquarters that it could advance no further without substantial resupply. The pattern repeated across the offensive zone. Units that had achieved breakthroughs now sat motionless, unable to exploit their success, unable to retreat if necessary, frozen in place by empty fuel tanks while American reinforcements moved toward them and Allied fighter bombers waited for clear weather. The German fuel delivery system was completely overwhelmed by demands it couldn't meet. Every unit was requesting immediate fuel resupply. Every commander was claiming priority designation. Every supply officer was explaining that his unit's mission was critical, but the fuel didn't exist to satisfy these demands. The depots in Germany contained perhaps 200,000 gallons that could theoretically be delivered forward, but the transportation network was shattered by Allied air attacks. The roads were clogged with military traffic moving both directions, and the distances from depot to forward units were increasing every day as the offensive progressed deeper into Belgium. Fuel trucks attempting to reach advance elements were burning 30 to 40% of their cargo just making the delivery run. December 18th also brought the first significant vehicle abandonments, a trend that would accelerate exponentially in coming days. When a Panther tank ran completely out of fuel in the middle of a Belgian road, the crew faced limited options. If friendly forces controlled the area and fuel might arrive, they could wait with the vehicle. If enemy forces were approaching or the tactical situation was deteriorating, they had to abandon the tank and withdraw on foot. The abandoned vehicles were supposed to be recovered and refueled when circumstances permitted, but circumstances never permitted. Recovery vehicles lacked fuel to conduct recovery operations, frontline positions were fluid, American forces were counterattacking in some sectors. The abandoned vehicles became permanent losses, not because enemy action destroyed them, but because German logistics couldn't sustain them. The tactical situation reports for December 18th showed German forces holding a salient approximately 50 miles deep at its maximum penetration, creating what would soon be nicknamed the Bulge on American operations maps. But the fuel situation maps showed something more ominous. A force that had reached its logistical culmination point days ahead of schedule, with operational endurance measured in tens of hours rather than days, bleeding immobile vehicles across every route of advance. Staff officers at Army Group B headquarters performed calculations they didn't share with Hitler. At current fuel consumption and delivery rates, the offensive would achieve complete immobility within 72 hours. The tanks would simply stop moving wherever they happened to be and become static pillboxes until American forces destroyed them or their crews abandoned them. Manteuffel sent a message to Model on December 18th evening that captured the crisis with brutal clarity. 5th Panzer Army has consumed approximately 60% of fuel allocation. Advance elements report critical shortages. Cannot sustain operations without immediate resupply of 200,000 litres minimum. Request emergency fuel allocation. The response arrived 6 hours later. 50,000 litres available. Conservation and captured enemy fuel must sustain operations. 50,000 litres, approximately 13,000 gallons for an entire Panzer Army. Manteuffel read the message, showed it to his chief of staff, and spoke words that several witnesses later recalled. "We are being ordered to continue an offensive that we cannot fuel. This is not military planning, this is fantasy." But the offensive continued, because stopping would mean admitting the fuel crisis had already defeated Germany's last strategic gamble. December 17th, 1944, Allied Tactical Air Base, Belgium. Major Thomas Griffin walked across the tarmac toward his P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, then stopped halfway and looked up at the sky with frustration etched across his face. Thick, overcast extended from horizon to horizon, the cloud ceiling perhaps 400 feet above ground, visibility less than half a mile in patches of fog and drizzle. No flying today, or yesterday, or the day before. Griffin's 9th Air Force Fighter Group had flown exactly 0 sorties since December 14th, despite reports of massive German armour formations moving through the Ardennes. The pilots were furious, maintenance crews kept aircraft ready for immediate launch, and everyone stared at weather forecasts, hoping for the clear skies that would let them do their jobs. Griffin didn't know it yet, but the overcast that frustrated him was Germany's only remaining advantage, a meteorological reprieve that would delay the offensive's collapse by perhaps 3 days, while simultaneously failing to solve the fundamental fuel crisis, killing German mobility. The weather conditions that descended over the Ardennes in mid-December were unremarkable for that season and region, but profoundly important for military operations. Persistent cloud cover, fog, drizzle, and occasional snow created conditions where Allied air power, the weapon that had dominated European battlefields since mid-1944, was effectively grounded. American tactical aviation required visual contact with targets for effective ground attack operations. Strategic bombers could theoretically bomb through clouds using radar, but targets as mobile as armoured columns needed visual identification. The weather from December 17th through December 22nd provided German forces a window of protection from aerial attack they hadn't experienced in months. It was the only piece of good fortune the offensive received. But the weather was a double-edged sword that cut German logistics as deeply as it protected German manoeuvre. Those same overcast conditions that grounded Allied fighters also made German fuel delivery infinitely more difficult. Truck convoys attempting to move fuel forward from German depots had to navigate roads turned to mud by rain and snow. Blackout conditions necessary to avoid aerial observation maintained even when weather made observation impossible meant convoys crawling through darkness using shielded lights and guides walking ahead of vehicles. Cold temperatures caused diesel fuel to gel in unheated tank trucks, requiring time-consuming heating before fuel could be pumped. The weather that gave Germany protection from Allied air power simultaneously degraded the fuel delivery system the offensive desperately needed. German fuel convoys during the weather window of December 17th through 22nd successfully delivered approximately 150,000 gallons to forward units, a non-trivial quantity that provided meaningful relief to some formations. 2nd Panzer Division received a fuel convoy on December 19th that allowed its advance to continue. Kampfgruppe Peiper got dribs and drabs of fuel that kept the formation moving intermittently. Various 6th Panzer Army units received enough fuel to maintain limited operations, but context matters. Those 150,000 gallons delivered over 6 days represented the total fruit of German logistics operating under optimal conditions without Allied air interdiction. During that same 6-day period, advancing German forces consumed approximately 900,000 gallons. The delivery rate was 1/6 of the consumption rate. The weather wasn't saving Germany. It was allowing Germany to lose more slowly. Allied air forces used the weather delay to prepare for what would come when visibility returned. Fighter bomber groups repositioned to forward air bases closer to the battle zone. Ground crews preloaded aircraft with bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Intelligence officers compiled target lists from reconnaissance data, prisoner interrogations, and tactical reports. Pilots studied maps showing suspected German supply routes, concentration areas, and approach corridors. When the weather finally broke, Allied aviation would launch what amounted to a pre-planned aerial massacre. But until the weather cleared, the Germans had time, and Germany attempted to use that time to solve fuel shortages that weather couldn't fix. The Wehrmacht quartermaster's assessment from December 20th, written during the weather window when German logistics operated under best-case conditions, revealed the bitter truth. Despite 6 days of protected delivery operations, German fuel status had deteriorated rather than improved. The offensive was consuming fuel faster than any delivery system could supply it, regardless of weather. Units that had been critically short on December 16th were now immobilized on December 20th. Formations that had adequate fuel initially were now reporting critical shortages. The fuel allocation that was supposed to last 6 to 7 days had been consumed in 4.5 days, and operational objectives were nowhere near achieved. The weather had given Germany a gift of time without aerial attacks, and Germany had used that gift to advance deeper into a fuel-exhausted dead end. The psychological impact of the weather on German troops was complex and ultimately counterproductive. Many soldiers interpreted the overcast as divine favor, proof that Providence supported Germany's cause, a sign that the offensive might succeed despite material disadvantages. Officers who knew better didn't discourage this magical thinking because morale mattered, and false hope was better than no hope. But the weather-induced optimism made the eventual return of Allied air power more psychologically devastating. Troops who had advanced under protective clouds, believing God favored them, would soon experience what American fighter bombers could do to exposed columns, and the shock would shatter whatever morale remained. December 22nd brought the first breaks in the overcast, allowing limited Allied reconnaissance flights. Photo interpreters examining the imagery received a shock. The scale of German vehicle abandonment was already far worse than battlefield reports suggested. Entire sections of road were lined with immobilized German tanks, trucks, and half-tracks, most showing no visible battle damage, simply sitting motionless. Intelligence officers initially suspected the images showed destroyed vehicles, but closer analysis revealed many were intact, abandoned in place, casualties of fuel exhaustion rather than combat. The photos showed the offensive's future, hundreds more abandoned vehicles waiting for Allied air power to find them and turn immobile targets into burning wreckage. On December 23rd, at 9:30 in the morning, the weather finally broke across much of the Ardennes battlefield. The overcast lifted to 6,000 feet in some areas, visibility improved to 5 miles, and Allied aircraft launched from dozens of bases simultaneously, 1,500 sorties on December 23rd alone, with priority given to German logistics networks and vehicle concentrations, P-47 Thunderbolts carrying bombs and rockets, P-51 Mustangs equipped for ground attack, British Typhoons with their feared armor-piercing rockets. American pilots later described their first clear weather missions over the Ardennes as target-rich beyond belief. German vehicles packed on roads, often stationary, unable to disperse or take effective cover. What the weather window had protected, clear skies would annihilate. The irony of the weather reprieve was complete. Germany had received 6 days of protection from aerial attack, had used those 6 days to deliver maximum possible fuel supplies, and had ended that period in worse fuel condition than when it began. The weather hadn't changed the fundamental impossibility of the offensive's fuel requirements. It had merely delayed the reckoning. When the clouds lifted on December 23rd, they revealed a German army that had advanced as far as available fuel could carry it and was now immobilized, exposed, and waiting for the aerial slaughter that had been inevitable since the offensive began. The weather window was Germany's last gift from circumstance, and Germany had used it to advance deeper into a trap from which fuel shortage made escape impossible. December 17, 1944, approaching Bulge, Belgium, Kampfgruppe Peiper's lead reconnaissance elements radioed back to the main column with information that sent a ripple of hope through the entire formation. Large fuel depot ahead, minimal security, multiple storage tanks visible. This was the moment German planning had depended on. The captured American fuel that would sustain the offensive when German supplies ran dry. Within 30 minutes, SS Panzergrenadiers had overwhelmed the small American Guard detachment and secured the depot. Engineers began pumping fuel immediately, tankers maneuvering into position to fill their nearly empty tanks. Then came the crushing realization. The depot contained approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline, but most of Peiper's armoured vehicles required diesel. The Kampfgruppe had captured substantial fuel. They couldn't use a ghost depot that existed but couldn't fulfill its planning purpose. The pattern would repeat across the offensive zone. American fuel depots that didn't exist where German intelligence expected them, that contained wrong-grade fuel that had been evacuated before German arrival, or that American engineers destroyed minutes before German forces arrived. The German intelligence assessment of American fuel depot locations, compiled through months of aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations, had identified 14 major supply installations between the German start line and the Meuse River. These depots theoretically contained between 3 and 5 million gallons of fuel quantities that could transform the offensive from logistically impossible to marginally sustainable if captured intact. The entire operational plan rested on this assumption. German forces would advance on limited internal fuel, capture American depots during the advance, and continue operations using captured supplies. It was logistics planning that assumed best-case outcomes at every stage, and warfare has never been kind to planners who assume best case. The Bulge depot, captured on December 17th, represented the offensive's most significant fuel seizure. Yet it illustrated every problem with the captured fuel strategy. The 50,000 gallons were real, not a phantom supply, but the grade mismatch meant most couldn't fuel the vehicles that most needed it. Peiper's engineers attempted to mix gasoline with diesel in ratios that might work in emergency situations, but the chemistry was unforgiving. Diesel engines running on gasoline mixtures experienced power loss, excessive wear, and potential catastrophic damage. Some half-tracks and trucks could use the gasoline, which provided modest benefit, but the tanks and tank destroyers that formed the Kampfgruppe's combat power remained critically short. German forces captured the fuel they needed, in the location they expected, and still couldn't solve their crisis. The Stavelot depot represented German planning's greatest near-miss and perhaps the offensive's most significant what-if moment. American supply units had established a major fuel depot near Stavelot containing approximately 2.5 million gallons, enough fuel to supply 6 Panzer Army's entire remaining requirement for the initial operational phase. German intelligence knew the depot existed in the general Stavelot area, though they didn't have its precise location. Kampfgruppe Peiper's route was partially selected to pass through Stavelot specifically to capture this depot. On December 18th, Peiper's lead elements approached Stavelot from the southeast, fighting through American defensive positions, advancing street by street toward the town centre. The fuel depot lay approximately 800 metres northwest of the town, guarded by a small detachment of American engineers and supply troops who could see German tanks entering Stavelot. The American engineers at Stavelot faced a decision that would affect the offensive's outcome more than any tactical battle: destroy the depot or attempt to hold it. Their orders were clear: deny fuel to German forces, but 2.5 million gallons of fuel represented months of logistics effort, enough supply to sustain American operations for weeks. The engineer lieutenant commanding the depot security detachment watched German tanks through binoculars, calculated how long until they reached his position, and made the hardest decision of his military career. At approximately 4 p.m. on December 18th, American engineers began pouring gasoline into prepared demolition trenches and setting explosive charges in storage tanks. 15 minutes later, the Stavelot depot erupted in flames and black smoke that climbed thousands of feet into the winter sky. Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance elements, now fighting in Stavelot's northern districts, could see the smoke. They knew what it meant. Their last realistic hope of fuel resupply had just literally gone up in smoke. German forces continued searching for American fuel depots throughout the offensive with increasing desperation. 2nd Panzer Division reached Nouville on December 19th, their route selection influenced by captured American maps showing a fuel depot in that area. They found empty fields. The depot had been relocated to Bastogne several days before the offensive began. 9th Panzer Division's advance toward March was partially guided by intelligence suggesting substantial American supply concentrations there. They captured some fuel, perhaps 20,000 gallons, but quantities far below intelligence estimates, and in any case, too late to fuel units that had already run dry miles behind the advance. The ghost depot phenomenon repeated. Supplies that intelligence claimed existed, that planning documents assumed, but that reality didn't provide. American fuel denial operations proved devastatingly effective, more through improvisation than systematic planning. US. First Army supply officers hadn't anticipated a major German offensive, but when it came, they reacted with impressive speed to evacuate or destroy fuel stocks. The massive depot at Spa, containing approximately 124,000 gallons, and located in an area German forces would reach by December 20th, was completely evacuated in a 36-hour period using every available truck. Supply convoys ran continuously, moving fuel to rear areas, completing the evacuation approximately 2 hours before German reconnaissance elements reached Spa's outskirts. The Americans hadn't planned for this contingency, but they executed it effectively through the initiative of supply officers who understood that fuel in German tanks was more dangerous than lost fuel they could replace. By December 20th, as intelligence officers at Army Group B headquarters compiled captured fuel assessments, the numbers were devastating. Total American fuel captured through first 5 days of offensive, approximately 250,000 gallons. Of that total, approximately 80,000 gallons were gasoline that could fuel only a fraction of German vehicles. Another 70,000 gallons were captured in small quantities scattered across dozens of locations, impossible to efficiently collect and distribute. The remaining 100,000 gallons, while useful, represented less than 10% of what German planning had assumed would be captured by this point. The offensive had consumed approximately 1.8 million gallons through December 20th. It had captured 250,000 gallons. The captured fuel strategy that underpinned operational planning had yielded 14% of expected results. The failure to capture adequate American fuel had cascading effects beyond simple supply shortage. German forces began modifying their tactical operations to prioritize supply capture over military objectives. Units detoured toward suspected depot locations rather than following assigned routes. Commanders ordered reconnaissance elements to search for American logistics installations instead of conducting enemy reconnaissance. Combat power that should have been directed at breaking through American defensive positions was instead wasted on wild goose chases, seeking fuel dumps that didn't exist or had already been evacuated. The offensive had transformed from a military operation with logistics support into a logistics scavenger hunt with military forces. And scavenger hunts don't win wars. Interrogations of captured German officers in late December revealed the psychological impact of the ghost depot phenomenon. Tank commanders described advancing with explicit orders to reach specific map coordinates where intelligence had promised fuel depots, finding nothing, and receiving orders to continue advancing toward new coordinates where more promised depots allegedly waited. The repeated disappointments destroyed whatever faith remained in higher headquarters planning. One captured major from 2nd Panzer Division told his interrogators, "By December 20th, we stopped believing the fuel depot reports. We knew we were being sent to find supplies that didn't exist. We advanced because we were ordered to, not because we thought we'd find fuel." When soldiers stop believing their commanders' operational assessments, military effectiveness collapses regardless of equipment or tactical skill. The final assessment of captured American fuel told a story of German planning's fundamental unseriousness. German operational documents had assumed capturing 3 million gallons of American fuel by December 21st. The actual capture through that date totaled approximately 300,000 gallons, usable by German vehicles, 10% of assumption, If German planning had been realistic, acknowledging that enemies generally destroy or evacuate supplies before abandonment, that captured fuel grades don't always match capturing forces' requirements, that chaos of combat degrades organized supply capture, then planners would have recognized the offensive was impossible without German-supplied fuel for the entire operation. But realistic planning would have meant cancelling the offensive, and cancelling the offensive would have meant admitting Germany had already lost. So planning assumed best case, reality delivered worst case, and the gap between assumption and reality was measured in hundreds of abandoned German tanks that ran dry, searching for ghost depots that existed primarily in pre-offensive intelligence documents and desperate commanders' hopes. December 15th, 1944, 5th Panzer Army Headquarters, Germany. General Hasso von Manteuffel gathered his division commanders for a final pre-offensive conference, and what he told them contradicted everything in the official operations orders. "Forget Antwerp," Manteuffel said quietly, studying the faces of men who had fought beside him on the Eastern Front and understood the difference between realistic objectives and Hitler's fantasies. "Our actual objective is Bastogne and the Meuse River at Dinant, 40 miles, not 125. We have fuel for perhaps 50 miles if we're disciplined and lucky. Plan accordingly." The officers nodded. They had already suspected this. Manteuffel was doing something remarkable and dangerous, conducting a realistic military operation inside an unrealistic strategic offensive, modifying objectives to match available resources, proving that even brilliant tactical adaptation couldn't overcome fundamental fuel poverty but could at least achieve something rather than nothing. Manteuffel represented the old Prussian military tradition at its finest. Aristocratic but not arrogant, educated in military history and theory, experienced in the brutal realities of Eastern Front combat, willing to speak truth to power even when truth was unwelcome. He had commanded divisions and corps in Russia, had witnessed German logistics collapse under Soviet counteroffensives, and understood intimately how fuel shortage transformed mobile warfare into static slaughter. When Hitler presented the Ardennes Plan in September, Manteuffel had been among the few senior officers who dared question the fuel calculations directly. Hitler had dismissed his concerns. Model had quietly told Manteuffel to plan for success with impossible limits rather than failure at impossible objectives. So Manteuffel had created his own operational concept inside the larger offensive, a limited penetration to achievable objectives using every drop of available fuel efficiently. The fuel allocation strategy Manteuffel implemented was ruthlessly pragmatic. Concentrate 70% of 5th Panzer Army's limited fuel in 2 divisions, 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, rather than distributing inadequate supplies across all formations. The remaining 3 divisions would receive minimal allocations, enough for limited operations but not sustained advance. Manteuffel was gambling that concentrated fuel in excellent divisions under skilled commanders would achieve more than dispersed fuel across mediocre formations. It was triage logistics, save what you can save, accept that the rest will fail, and make the hard choices that professional soldiers must make when resources don't match requirements. The decision effectively wrote off 3 divisions as offensive forces, but it gave 2 divisions a genuine chance to accomplish something. December 17th through 19th saw Manteuffel's gambit produce 5th Panzer Army's impressive initial successes. 2nd Panzer Division, commanded by Colonel Meinrad von Lauschet, advanced with the fuel discipline of a formation that knew every gallon counted. Lauschet ordered his lead battalions to move in calculated bounds. Advance 10 kilometers, consolidate, refuel from following echelons, advance another 10 kilometers. No wild charges. No dramatic exploitation attempts that might leave spearheads stranded. Methodical, professional advance that maximized distance per gallon consumed. By December 19th, 2nd Panzer Division had penetrated approximately 35 miles, reaching Longvilly and approaching Bastogne's outskirts, the deepest penetration achieved by any German formation in the offensive's first 4 days. Panzer Lehr under General Fritz Bayerlein achieved similar success with similar methods. Bayerlein, a veteran of North Africa and Normandy, understood fuel constraint intimately. He had watched Rommel's Africa Corps starve for fuel in the desert, had seen the Normandy campaign collapse partially from petroleum shortage. In the Ardennes, he ran Panzer Lehr like a long-distance race rather than a sprint. Steady pace, minimal maneuvering, strict fuel accounting at every level. His division reached Bastogne's perimeter by December 19th. having covered approximately 30 miles with fuel to spare for continued operations. Had Bayerlein been permitted to bypass Bastogne and continue toward the Meuse, he might have achieved the breakthrough that eluded the rest of the offensive. But Hitler's orders demanded Bastogne's capture, and Bayerlein spent the next week battering against American defences in static fighting that burned fuel without gaining ground. The contrast between Manteuffel's sector and Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army sector was instructive and damning. 6th Panzer Army, with more fuel, better equipment, and Hitler's personal favour, achieved penetrations of roughly 25 miles at maximum. 5th Panzer Army, with less fuel and lower priority, achieved 45 miles. The difference wasn't equipment or troops, it was command competence and realistic planning. Manteuffel's forces moved efficiently because Manteufel understood logistics, determined operations. Dietrich's forces foundered because Dietrich planned as if fuel would magically appear when needed. Professional military education versus party loyalty, Prussian staff tradition versus Nazi cronyism. The results spoke for themselves. By December 21st, 2nd Panzer Division had reached Selles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River, crossing at Dinant, the offensive's deepest penetration and closest approach to operational objectives. But Selles also marked the point where even Manteuffel's superior fuel management reached its mathematical limit. The division's fuel state on December 21st, approximately 0.5 gallons per vehicle remaining. Tanks sat with engines running on fumes, unable to advance, unable to retreat, frozen in place by empty fuel tanks. American forces were approaching from multiple directions, Allied fighter bombers were returning to clear skies, and 2nd Panzer Division, the offensive's most successful formation, was about to be destroyed, not because American forces defeated it in battle, but because its fuel gauge read empty. Manteufel sent a series of increasingly desperate messages to Model and OKW throughout December 21st and 22nd. The operational content was identical. 5th Panzer Army had reached its logistical culmination point, had consumed 85% of fuel allocation, could not continue offensive operations without substantial resupply, recommended consolidating gains rather than continuing toward impossible objectives. The responses ranged from vague promises of fuel delivery to orders to continue attacking to silence. Hitler, receiving reports that German forces had reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River, interpreted this as proof the offensive could succeed and ordered continued advance. That the forces closest to the Meuse were completely out of fuel apparently didn't register, or if it did, Hitler assumed willpower would overcome mathematics, as it always had in his imagination. The tragedy of Manteuffel's success was that it encouraged unrealistic expectations at the highest command levels. If 5th Panzer Army could reach 45 miles on inadequate fuel, Hitler reasoned, then adequate fuel would carry them the full 125 miles to Antwerp. The logic was superficially plausible and fundamentally wrong. Manteufel had achieved 45 miles by concentrating resources, accepting calculated risks, benefiting from surprise and weak American defenses, and using every drop of fuel with maximum efficiency. Those conditions weren't repeatable. Surprise was gone, American defenses were strengthening, fuel concentration had been maximized. There was no more efficiency to extract. 45 miles was 5th Panzer Army's absolute maximum range, and even reaching that range had required professional excellence that couldn't be commanded into existence across an entire army group. December 22nd brought Manteufel's clearest assessment of reality, delivered in a message to Model that was remarkable for its bluntness. 5th Panzer Army has achieved maximum advance possible with available fuel. 2nd Panzer Division is immobilized at Selles. Panzerlehr is fixed before Bastogne. All formations report critical fuel shortage. Consumption has exceeded allocation. No reserves remain. Without immediate fuel resupply of at least 200,000 litres, this army can neither advance nor conduct organised withdrawal. Recommend consolidating present positions and transitioning to defensive operations. The message was professional military assessment. We did what was possible. We reached our limit. Continuing is impossible. Here are the alternatives. Model forwarded the message to OKW with his endorsement. Hitler's response came back within hours. Continue offensive operations. Fuel is being dispatched. The fuel that Hitler promised was dispatched, never arrived in quantities that mattered. A few trucks reached some units. Small deliveries provided temporary relief to isolated formations. But the systematic resupply needed to restore offensive capability never materialized because it didn't exist. Germany had no strategic fuel reserves to dispatch. The synthetic fuel plants remained destroyed. The delivery network was overwhelmed and partially interdicted. The fuel allocated to the offensive had been consumed, and there was no more fuel to allocate. Hitler's promise was fantasy, and Manteuffel knew it, but orders were orders, and so 5th Panzer Army continued attempting offensive operations with vehicles that had no fuel to operate. The supreme irony of Manteuffel's gambit was that his competence made the offensive worse for Germany. If 5th Panzer Army had failed as completely as 6th Panzer Army, the offensive might have been called off by December 20th, limiting losses. Instead, Manteuffel's success to Sellers gave Hitler hope that continued operations might yet achieve breakthrough. That hope kept the offensive grinding forward for another week, consuming irreplaceable men and equipment in attacks that accomplished nothing except increased casualties. Manteuffel had proven that a realistic German offensive with limited objectives might have achieved tactical success. Instead, his professionalism was exploited to prolong strategic failure. He had shown what German forces could do with competent leadership and realistic planning, and by doing so, he had unintentionally extended an offensive that should have been cancelled, wasting resources that Germany could never replace. By December 24th, Manteuffel's situation was desperate. His furthest advance elements at Selles were cut off and would be destroyed within 48 hours. His forces around Bastogne were achieving nothing against American defences. His divisions reported 90% fuel exhaustion with no prospect of resupply. His casualties were mounting as American reinforcements arrived and Allied air power resumed operations. He had taken his army as far as professional skill and available resources could carry it, and now he watched it being destroyed because higher headquarters couldn't accept that fuel mathematics made continuation impossible. Manteuffel had played the hand he was dealt, as well as any general could have played it. But when the cards include empty fuel tanks and impossible objectives, even brilliant play produces losing outcomes. 5th Panzer Army's relative success proved only that competence cannot overcome fundamental resource insufficiency, that realistic tactics cannot salvage unrealistic strategy, and that fighting efficiently merely allows you to lose more slowly when the war itself cannot be won. December 16th, 1944, 11 p.m., Lanzerath Crossroads, Belgium. SS Obersturmenführer Joachim Peiper stood in the turret of his command Panther, staring forward at a traffic jam that stretched into the darkness ahead of him. Kampfgruppe 100 tanks, 5,000 men, Germany's designated spearhead for the entire offensive, sat motionless on a forest road, unable to advance because fuel-starved vehicles ahead had broken down and blocked the route. Peiper had been scheduled to reach his first-day objective at 6 p.m. It was now 5 hours past that timeline, and his Kampfgruppe hadn't even properly entered Belgium. Behind him, his tanks idled, burning precious fuel while stationary, their fuel gauges dropping while they moved 0 kilometers forward. Peiper was already 6 hours behind schedule, already consuming fuel faster than planned, already experiencing the fuel crisis that would define his entire operation. In 8 days, his Kampfgruppe would be destroyed, not by American forces, by empty fuel tanks. Joachim Peiper embodied the Waffen-SS at both its most effective and most morally bankrupt. At 29 years old, he had commanded armoured formations on the Eastern Front with tactical skill that earned respect even from professional Wehrmacht officers. He was brave, aggressive, and utterly ruthless qualities that made him an excellent combat leader and a war criminal. His Kampfgruppe for the Ardennes offensive represented Germany's elite. The newest Panther tanks, scarce Tiger IIs with their invincible frontal armour and 88mm guns, the most experienced crews, the best equipment Germany could assemble. If any formation could achieve the breakthrough to the Meuse River bridges, it should be Peiper's. But elite troops and superior equipment meant nothing when fuel tanks were empty. The fuel allocation Peiper received before the offensive represented both priority treatment and impossible inadequacy. Kampfgruppe Peiper got approximately 110,000 gallons of fuel, roughly 50% more than standard divisional allocations, recognition of the Kampfgruppe's importance as 6th Panzer Army's spearhead. This allocation would carry the Kampfgruppe approximately 50 miles under ideal conditions. Good roads, minimal combat manoeuvring, no delays. The Meuse River bridges at Peiper's objective lay 97 miles from his start line. Simple arithmetic revealed the impossible equation. Fuel for 50 miles, objective at 97 miles, deficit of 47 miles that could only be covered by capturing American fuel en route. Peiper's entire operation depended on finding and capturing Allied fuel depots during the advance, a dependency that should have disqualified the plan as unserious. December 17th, 4 a.m., Bulge. After finally breaking free of the traffic jams, Peiper's lead elements overran the American fuel depot with textbook efficiency, a lightning raid that captured the facility before defenders could organize demolition. The Kampfgruppe supply officers immediately began pumping fuel, and for approximately 30 minutes, Peiper allowed himself to believe the operation might succeed. Then reality asserted itself. The depot contained 50,000 gallons of gasoline, and most of Peiper's tanks ran on diesel. The Panthers and Tiger IIs that formed his armoured punch couldn't use the captured fuel without severe engine damage. The half-tracks and trucks could use it, which provided some benefit, but the tanks that most needed fuel, that consumed fuel fastest, that would determine whether the Kampfgruppe reached its objectives, remained critically short. Peiper's engineers rigged elaborate filtration systems, attempting to make the gasoline work in diesel engines, but chemistry doesn't compromise with desperation. The Stavelot fuel depot represented Peiper's last realistic hope and ultimate nightmare. German intelligence had identified a major American fuel concentration in the Stavelot area, 2.5 million gallons, enough to fuel Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse and beyond, enough to transform the operation from logistically impossible to genuinely threatening. Peiper's route was deliberately selected to pass through Stavelot. His timeline demanded reaching the town by evening December 17th. December 18th at dawn, his lead elements finally approached Stavelot after a night of delays, detours, and fuel-consuming combat. American defenders fought stubbornly in the town, delaying Peiper's advance street by street. From his command position, Peiper could see smoke rising from the northwest, thick, black, petroleum smoke climbing into the winter sky. He knew immediately what it meant. American engineers were destroying the depot, his fuel salvation was burning, his operation was finished. December 19th through 23rd, L'Église, Peiper's Kampfgruppe reached this small Belgian town, approximately 57 miles from the start line, and effectively stopped. Not because American forces blocked further advance, though American resistance was stiffening, but because fuel gauges read empty across the formation. Peiper attempted to continue operations, launching probing attacks towards Starmont, attempting to find routes forward, but each movement consumed fuel that couldn't be replaced. By December 20th, his Panthers and Tiger IIs were running on fumes, literally using their final drops of fuel. Tactical mobility ceased. Strategic mobility had never existed. The Kampfgruppe became a static defensive position, elite armor reduced to immobile pillboxes, waiting for the inevitable American counterattack. The fuel accounting for Peiper's operation told a story of inevitable failure. The Kampfgruppe had started with approximately 110,000 gallons. It captured perhaps 15,000 gallons in various small caches and roadside captures, plus the 50,000 gallons of mostly unusable gasoline at Bulge. Total fuel available, approximately 175,000 gallons, maximum. Much of it wrong grade. Fuel consumption from start line to L'Église, approximately 57 miles, including combat maneuvering, cold weather idling, and tactical repositioning, estimated 120,000 gallons. Remaining fuel at approximately 55,000 gallons, much of it in wrong-grade gasoline. Fuel needed to reach Meuse River bridges from L'Église, approximately 40 miles remaining, at least 80,000 gallons of compatible fuel. The mathematics were pitiless. Peiper was 40 miles from his objective, with 70% of the fuel needed to cover that distance, and no fuel resupply was coming. December 24th, L'Église became a death trap. American forces had surrounded the position. Allied fighter bombers were strafing anything that moved. Peiper's fuel was exhausted. His ammunition was running low. His casualties were mounting. At approximately 2 p.m., Peiper made the decision no German commander wanted to make: abandon all heavy equipment and attempt breakout on foot. His staff prepared demolition charges for the vehicles, not because American action had destroyed them, but because empty fuel tanks made them unsalvageable. That night, Peiper led his remaining 1,400 men through American lines, leaving behind the most concentrated collection of German armour abandoned in the entire Western campaign. 39 Panthers, 26 Tiger IIs, 40 Panzer IVs, plus all supporting vehicles, 105 armoured vehicles abandoned at L'Église, creating an impromptu German armor museum for Belgian civilians and Allied intelligence officers. The abandoned equipment at L'Église told multiple stories simultaneously. First, it proved German technological sophistication. Tiger IIs, with their virtually impenetrable frontal armor, Panthers with their excellent guns and sloped armor design, all representing German engineering at its peak. Second, it proved technological sophistication means nothing without fuel. Every abandoned tank was mechanically functional, could have continued fighting with fuel, but sat motionless because their fuel tanks were empty. Third, it proved how catastrophically the fuel crisis had undermined German operations. This wasn't a company that ran out of fuel, or even a battalion. This was an entire Kampfgruppe, Germany's elite spearhead, immobilized by fuel shortage. American ordnance officers examining the vehicles found fuel tanks bone dry, fuel filters clean, engines in good condition. These weren't vehicles worn out by combat, they were vehicles that had simply run out of gas. Peiper's post-war interrogation provided the operation's epitaph. American intelligence officers asked him why Kampfgruppe Peiper failed to reach the Meuse. Peiper's answer was blunt. We were not beaten by the Americans. We were beaten by our empty tanks. On December 18th, I had enough fuel for perhaps 25 kilometers. I was 50 kilometers from my objective. Simple mathematics. The Americans fought well, but they didn't defeat us. Our fuel shortage defeated us. The interrogator noted that Peiper seemed almost relieved to explain this, as if fuel shortage was a more honourable defeat than tactical failure. Perhaps it was. A commander can do nothing about empty fuel tanks. But Peiper had executed an operation he must have known was fuel-doomed from the beginning, and that raised uncomfortable questions about professional responsibility. The human cost of Peiper's operation extended beyond the Kampfgruppe's 3,600 casualties. During the advance, Peiper's troops massacred 84 American prisoners at Malmedy Crossroads, murdered numerous Belgian civilians, and committed various atrocities that would lead to Peiper's conviction for war crimes. Some historians suggest the atrocities were partly driven by Peiper's frustration at fuel cause delays, that murdering prisoners was easier than guarding them when every minute counted toward reaching fuel depots before they were destroyed. If true, this would mean fuel shortage didn't just defeat Peiper's operation militarily, but contributed to moral collapse that produced war crimes. The hypothesis is unprovable, but the timeline is suggestive. Malmedy massacre occurred December 17th, during the period when Peiper was most desperately racing towards Stavelot Depot, when every delay meant captured fuel becoming destroyed fuel, when time pressure was most acute. The final accounting of Peiper's race revealed the futility of elite forces with inadequate logistics. Germany's best troops, best equipment, best commander for this type of operation, highest fuel priority. Result: 57 miles penetration, 0 strategic objectives achieved, entire force destroyed, 3,600 casualties, 105 vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. If Germany's most elite formation with priority fuel allocation couldn't succeed, then success was simply impossible regardless of tactical performance. Peiper had proven nothing except that running out of fuel ends operations as surely as running out of soldiers, and that sophisticated equipment without fuel is sophisticated junk. The 90-mile nightmare ended 40 miles short because the laws of physics don't care about elite status or tactical skill or operational boldness. Empty fuel tanks stop, even Tiger IIs. That was Peiper's lesson, written in abandoned armour scattered across Belgian roads from Lanzerath to L'Église. December 22nd, 1944, route Malmedy to Stavelot. Captain Robert Morrison, commanding a U.S. Army Engineer Battalion, stood beside his jeep and stared in disbelief at the spectacle stretching ahead. German vehicles abandoned in such density that his unit couldn't drive down the road without moving them first. 67 tanks, half-tracks, and trucks sat motionless along a 12-mile stretch, most showing no visible battle damage, many with hatches open and supplies still stowed, as if the crews had simply stepped out for coffee and never returned. Morrison walked to the nearest Panther tank, climbed on the hull, and checked the fuel gauge. Empty. He checked another. Empty. A Tiger II further down the road. Empty. He was looking at hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks worth of German armoured vehicles, abandoned not because American forces destroyed them, but because they'd simply run out of gas. In a decade of engineering work, Morrison had seen collapsed bridges, destroyed factories, and bombed cities. But he'd never seen an army abandon its equipment in such quantities simply because it couldn't fuel them. This was defeat written in empty fuel tanks. The phenomenon of abandoned German armor in the Ardennes was unprecedented in the Western campaign's history. In previous battles, German forces retreating under pressure generally recovered their disabled vehicles or destroyed them to prevent capture. Professional armies didn't abandon functional equipment, but the fuel crisis created conditions where recovery was impossible and destruction was impractical. A Panther that ran dry 10 miles behind friendly lines might theoretically be recovered once fuel arrived, but fuel never arrived, and within days, American forces controlled the area. A Tiger II immobilized beside a road could be destroyed by its crew, but that required time and explosives, and crews abandoning vehicles during tactical withdrawals rarely had either. The result was a trail of abandoned steel marking the offensive's furthest penetrations like breadcrumbs in a nightmare fairy tale. American recovery teams operating in late December and January began documenting the abandoned vehicles with growing astonishment at the scale. 2nd Armored Division's after-action report noted capturing or finding abandoned 82 German armored vehicles in the Sellies area alone, most intact or near intact, most showing fuel exhaustion as primary cause of abandonment. 82nd Airborne Division reported 43 abandoned German vehicles in the Werbermont sector. 1st Infantry Division found 37 abandoned vehicles along its sector of the front. The reports multiplied. Every American unit advancing into areas the Germans had briefly held found abandoned armor. The total numbers were staggering. By January 15th, American forces had recovered or documented approximately 324 German armored fighting vehicles, lost primarily to fuel shortage rather than combat action. The diary of a German soldier found in an abandoned Panther near Hufeleis provided the human perspective. December 20th, out of fuel, engine won't start. Commander says we wait for resupply. December 21st, still no fuel. Americans shelling our position. Commander says we may have to abandon the tank. December 22nd, Americans attacking. Commander ordered us to destroy the Panther, but we have no explosives. We're leaving it. Walking back to our lines. They said the offensive would change everything. We couldn't even drive to the war. Now we're walking away from a perfectly good tank because nobody brought us fuel. The diary ended there. Whether the soldier survived isn't recorded, but his abandoned Panther survived, recovered by Americans, and eventually shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground for evaluation. American ordnance evaluation teams examining captured and abandoned German vehicles reached surprising conclusions about their condition. A technical intelligence report from January 1945 noted, examination of 63 German AFVs captured in Ardennes offensive reveals approximately 60% mechanically functional at time of abandonment. Fuel tanks uniformly empty or near empty, tracks, engines, transmissions generally serviceable. Many vehicles appear to have been carefully parked and locked, suggesting crews expected to return when fuel arrived. These are not worn-out vehicles discarded due to mechanical failure. These are functional military equipment abandoned due to consumable shortage. The report's implications were profound. Germany had lost more effective armor to fuel shortage than to American action. The abandonment patterns revealed how the fuel crisis had evolved throughout the offensive. Early abandonments December 16th through 18th were relatively sparse, single vehicles here and there that had run dry while the formation continued. Middle period abandonments December 19th through 22nd increased in density as entire platoons and companies ran out of fuel simultaneously, creating clusters of abandoned vehicles at specific locations. Late period abandonments December 23rd through 26th reached catastrophic levels as entire battalions became immobilized, creating vehicle graveyards where German formations had simply stopped moving en masse when their collective fuel exhausted. The spatial distribution mapped the offensive's collapse. Advance routes marked by abandoned vehicles, density increasing toward the furthest penetrations, the trail of steel documenting where German mobility had died. Specific abandoned vehicle concentrations became infamous. La Gliese, where Peiper left 105 vehicles, became the most spectacular single example. Sellies, where 2nd Panzer Division's spearhead died, yielded 82 abandoned vehicles in a concentrated area. The Longvilly-Bastogne road featured dozens of abandoned German vehicles from multiple formations, all converging on Bastogne and running dry in proximity to that objective. The Hufeleis area became a maze of abandoned armour from various units retreating through that road junction after fuel exhaustion ended their offensive capability. Each concentration told a story of units that had advanced to that point and no further because that's where their fuel ran out. The impossibility of German recovery operations highlighted the comprehensive nature of Germany's logistical collapse. Under normal circumstances, armies recovered disabled vehicles using specialized recovery tanks, vehicles like the Bulge Panzer variants built on Panther and Tiger chassis, specifically for towing disabled armor. But Germany's Bulge Panzers faced the same fuel crisis as combat vehicles. They couldn't be sent forward to recover immobilized tanks because they'd burn fuel getting there, burn more fuel performing recovery, and probably run dry themselves before completing the mission. The few recovery attempts that occurred generally failed when recovery vehicles ran out of fuel mid-operation. Germany lacked fuel to fight and lacked fuel to recover the fighting vehicles that lacked fuel. The entire system had collapsed into recursive failure. The human cost of abandonment extended beyond lost equipment to lost crews. Tank crews abandoning their vehicles behind American lines faced harrowing withdrawals through enemy-held territory. Some made it back to German lines after days of evading American patrols, crossing frozen streams, hiding in barns and forests. Others were captured, becoming prisoners of war, and surviving the war's final months in Allied custody, arguably a better fate than remaining in the collapsing German military. Some were killed by American forces who encountered them during their withdrawal attempts. The exact casualties among crews who abandoned vehicles are difficult to calculate, but 6th Panzer Army alone reported over 3,000 missing soldiers in late December, many of them crew members who abandoned immobilized vehicles and didn't return. The propaganda impact of abandoned German vehicles was considerable for both sides. American photographers and newsreel cameramen documented the abandoned armor extensively, creating powerful images of German defeat, mighty Tiger IIs, sitting forlorn beside Belgian roads, Panthers half hidden in forests, all immobilized and helpless. These images appeared in American newspapers and newsreels, providing visual proof that German military power was broken. For German troops still fighting, reports of massive vehicle abandonment were devastating to morale. Soldiers who had been told the offensive would change the war's course learned that Germany's elite formations were abandoning their equipment for lack of fuel. If the best equipped units couldn't get fuel, what hope did regular formations have? American forces adapted their tactics based on abandoned vehicle discoveries. Intelligence officers realized that finding abandoned German vehicles indicated fuel exhaustion in that sector, suggesting continued American pressure would collapse German resistance faster than conventional combat. Tank destroyer units began specifically targeting German logistics vehicles, fuel trucks, supply columns, repair vehicles, knowing that destroying German logistics multiplied the fuel crisis. Fighter bomber pilots were briefed to prioritize fuel trucks over other targets, understanding that each destroyed fuel vehicle immobilized multiple combat vehicles. The abandoned armor revealed Germany's critical vulnerability, and American forces exploited that vulnerability systematically. By early January 1945, the abandoned vehicle count exceeded all reasonable predictions. American ordnance officers estimated total German armor committed to the Ardennes offensive at approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns. By January 15th, approximately 600 had been lost to all causes: combat destruction, abandonment, capture. Of those 600 losses, American analysis suggested approximately 53%, roughly 320 vehicles were abandoned, primarily due to fuel shortage rather than destroyed in combat. More than half of German armor losses were logistics failures rather than tactical defeats. The offensive had lost more tanks to empty fuel tanks than to American guns, a ratio that should have been impossible for a competent military, but had become reality for an army whose logistics system had completely collapsed. The final image haunting Allied soldiers who advanced through the Ardennes battlefield was the sight of beautiful, terrible machines sitting abandoned beside roads, in forests, in farm fields. A Tiger II near Mannheim, its 88mm gun still operational, its armor impervious to most Allied weapons, sitting motionless because its fuel tank was empty. A Panther near Hofelize, with a handwritten sign on the turret: "Kein Benzin, no fuel." A message from German crews to their army, to history, to anyone who would listen. These weren't crude T-34 seconds that could be replaced by thousands. These were sophisticated machines representing months of manufacturing effort, scarce alloys, skilled labor. Each abandoned tank was an industrial masterpiece Germany couldn't afford to lose and couldn't afford to fuel. The trail of abandoned steel marked not just the Ardennes offensive's failure, but Germany's comprehensive defeat in the logistical war that ultimately determines all military outcomes. Steel without fuel is sculpture, not weaponry. And the Ardennes had become an open-air museum of German military sculpture, beautiful, deadly, and utterly immobile. December 23rd, 1944, 9:30 a.m., altitude 8,000 feet above Belgium. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson banked his P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber into a gentle turn and stared down at the most target-rich environment he had witnessed in 18 months of combat flying. The overcast that had shrouded the Ardennes battlefield for 6 days had finally lifted, visibility extended to 5 miles, and the ground below revealed German forces exposed in concentrations that seemed almost suicidal. A road packed with vehicles stretching for 2 miles, many stationary, none dispersed for air defense. A forest clearing filled with tanks parked in neat rows like a motor pool display. A supply column halted on an open hillside with no concealment whatsoever. Johnson's wingman radioed, "Are they surrendering? Why aren't they hiding?" Johnson replied, "They can't hide. They can't move. They're out of fuel. Let's go to work." What followed was not air combat. It was aerial slaughter enabled by German fuel starvation. The return of Allied air power after 6 days of weather protection hit German forces like a natural disaster, sudden, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Allied commanders had used the weather delay to position maximum air power close to the battlefield. 9th Air Force had relocated fighter bomber groups to forward Belgian air bases. 8th Air Force had pre-positioned strategic bombers for immediate launch when weather cleared. British 2nd Tactical Air Force had prepared Typhoon squadrons with full bomb and rocket loads. When visibility improved on December 23rd, Allied air forces launched approximately 1,500 sorties in a single day, more than the entire Luftwaffe could muster on the Western Front in a week. The aircraft came in waves, fighter bombers attacking anything moving on roads, medium bombers hitting concentrations and choke points, heavy bombers destroying German supply depots in rear areas. The sky filled with Allied aircraft while the Luftwaffe barely appeared. The German fuel crisis made Allied air attacks catastrophically effective in ways normal circumstances wouldn't have permitted. Professional armies under air attack disperse forces, use terrain for concealment, move primarily at night, and maintain air defense discipline. But German forces in late December 1944 couldn't disperse because dispersal required fuel to move off roads. They couldn't use terrain effectively because reaching better positions required fuel they didn't have. They couldn't move at night because they couldn't move at all. Empty fuel tanks don't care whether it's day or night. They were immobilized targets waiting for Allied aircraft to find them, and Allied aircraft found them with devastating efficiency. The German ground perspective of December 23rd air attacks appears repeatedly in prisoner interrogations and captured documents with variations on the same theme: helplessness. A Panzer soldier, we heard them coming. The fighter bombers dove and dropped bombs. We couldn't move, couldn't hide, couldn't fight back. Just wait to die or survive by luck. A 12th SS Panzer Division report: units subjected to continuous air attack December 23rd, attempted to reposition to better cover. Vehicles lacked fuel to move. 17 vehicles destroyed by air action in stationary positions. A Wehrmacht supply officer: my entire convoy was caught on open road by American fighter bombers. We had no fuel to continue forward, no fuel to retreat, no ability to disperse off-road. They destroyed 23 trucks in 15 minutes. I survived because I was in the last vehicle and jumped into a ditch. Allied pilots' after-action reports from December 23rd reflect their shock at target abundance. A 9th Air Force group, pilots reported destroying 63 German vehicles in single sortie. Targets were not moving. Many appeared abandoned but were included in count per standard procedure. Another unit attacked German column on road northeast of Hofelize, column stationary. Minimal anti-aircraft fire, destroyed or damaged 41 vehicles without loss to own aircraft. The reports repeated similar themes: stationary targets, weak defences, heavy destruction. What Allied pilots were describing was shooting fish in a barrel, a brutal phrase but accurate description of attacking immobilised forces. December 24th saw the pattern intensify, with approximately 1,300 Allied sorties hitting German forces, already reeling from the previous day's attacks. The Christmas Eve massacre, as some American pilots termed it, specifically targeted German supply columns attempting to deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units. Allied intelligence had identified critical supply routes based on traffic analysis and ultra intercepts. Fighter bombers were directed to these routes with orders to hit anything moving. The result was devastating. Allied aircraft destroyed an estimated 200 German vehicles on December 24th, with fuel trucks receiving priority attention. Each destroyed fuel truck prevented 1,500 to 3,000 gallons from reaching frontline units, immobilizing 5 to 10 additional armored vehicles. The multiplier effect was cruel. Destroying fuel delivery vehicles deepened the fuel crisis, which increased the number of immobilized targets, which made subsequent air attacks more effective. The Luftwaffe's response to Allied air dominance demonstrated how completely German fuel shortage had broken all military systems. The Luftwaffe possessed approximately 2,000 fighters in Germany and the Low Countries in late December 1944, theoretically sufficient numbers to contest Allied air superiority. But those fighters were grounded because aviation fuel production had collapsed even more completely than ground vehicle fuel. Luftwaffe operational fuel allocation for December stood at approximately 10% of normal requirements. Pilots flew training missions on bicycles, literally pedaling around airfields in patterns, while instructors shouted corrections because no fuel existed for actual flying training. When Luftwaffe fighters did appear over the Ardennes on December 23 and 24, they flew perhaps 100 sorties total against Allied 1,500 to 1,300 sorties, a 15-to-1 numerical disadvantage that reflected fuel shortage rather than aircraft or pilot shortage. The psychological impact on German ground forces of Allied air dominance without Luftwaffe protection was devastating. Soldiers who had advanced under protective overcast, convinced that weather favoured Germany's cause, now experienced what American air power could do to exposed forces. The shock was comprehensive. German troops had experienced Allied air superiority throughout 1944, but the preceding week of protection had created false hope that circumstances had changed. The return of Allied aircraft shattered that hope absolutely. Post-battle prisoner interrogations revealed that morale collapse on December 24th and 25th was often attributed more to air attacks than ground combat. German soldiers could fight American infantry and armor with some prospect of survival. They couldn't fight American aircraft while sitting immobilized by empty fuel tanks. The Christmas Eve airlift to Bastogne provided the most visible and psychologically devastating contrast between Allied and German logistics. While German forces starved for fuel and supplies, American C-47 transport aircraft flew supply missions to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne in broad daylight with minimal losses. German soldiers watching this spectacle understood its implications. Americans could fly supply missions in contested airspace, while German vehicles sat immobilized on roads for lack of fuel. The contrast between Allied abundance and German poverty couldn't have been made more starkly. Some German units attempted to shoot down the C-47 seconds, but anti-aircraft ammunition was also running short, another manifestation of comprehensive logistics failure. December 25th and 26th brought continued Allied air attacks with slightly reduced sortie counts, approximately 1,000 per day, as weather deteriorated again, but never to the complete overcast of December. 17th through 22nd, Allied fighter bombers had learned the locations of German concentrations, had established patrol patterns covering major routes, and systematically destroyed anything moving or stationary that might support German operations. The unofficial Allied pilot motto for these missions became, "If it's on a road in the Bulge, it's a target." The destruction estimates from December 23rd through 26th totaled approximately 500 to 700 German vehicles destroyed by air action, with perhaps 40% of those being fuel or supply trucks. That multiplied the crisis by preventing resupply. The final accounting of the weather reprieve and its aftermath revealed the cruel mathematics of modern warfare. Germany had received 6 days of protection from Allied air attack, during which it advanced as far as fuel would carry and consumed most available supplies. Allied air forces had used those 6 days to position for maximum effect when weather improved. When visibility returned, Allied aircraft found German forces immobilized by fuel shortage in exposed positions, unable to disperse or defend effectively. The combination of fuel starvation and air dominance was synergistically lethal. Fuel shortage created immobility created vulnerability, air attacks exploited vulnerability, Air attacks destroyed remaining fuel supplies, deepening fuel shortage in recursive failure. German forces were caught in a death spiral where each problem made other problems worse. The Thunderbolt had returned, and what it found was not a dangerous enemy force requiring careful engagement, but a helpless target waiting for destruction, immobilized by the fuel crisis that had already defeated Germany before the first bomb fell. January 1945, U.S. First Army Headquarters. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, First Army Intelligence Chief, presented his after-action assessment of the Ardennes offensive to a room full of American commanders and staff officers. The presentation consisted largely of mathematics, fuel calculations, consumption rates, available supplies, captured depots, distance traveled. Dixon's conclusion was brutally simple. The German offensive failed because it was mathematically impossible from conception. They started with 1.2 million gallons of fuel available. They required 4.5 million gallons to reach operational objectives. The deficit was 3.3 million gallons, a shortage so enormous that no tactical success could overcome it. German forces advanced until their fuel ran out, then stopped. The offensive didn't fail because we defeated it. The offensive failed because arithmetic defeated it. The room was silent. Defeating an enemy army is satisfying. Watching an enemy army defeat itself through logistical impossibility is merely sad. The comprehensive fuel accounting for the Ardennes offensive told a story without ambiguity or room for interpretation. German forces began December 16th with approximately 1.2 million gallons in forward depots, the product of months of hoarding and the final allocation the Wehrmacht could scrape together. During the offensive, German logistics delivered approximately 700,000 gallons to forward areas, a remarkable effort given Allied air attacks, damaged infrastructure, and competing demands. German forces captured approximately 250,000 gallons of American fuel, some usable, much of it wrong grade. Total fuel available to German forces during the offensive, approximately 2.15 million gallons. The operational requirement to reach Antwerp, calculated by German staff officers before the offensive, 4.5 million gallons minimum. The deficit, 2.35 million gallons, or 52% short of requirement. Simple arithmetic. The actual consumption patterns proved even worse than planning assumptions predicted. German forces consumed approximately 2 million gallons during the offensive from December 16th through December 26th, the period of active operations before complete collapse. This consumption occurred while advancing approximately 50 miles at maximum penetration, less than half the 125 miles to Antwerp. The fuel efficiency calculation was damning. German forces consumed approximately 40,000 gallons per mile of advance. At that consumption rate, reaching Antwerp would have required 5 million gallons, more than twice what was available, and 10% more than planning estimates assumed. Even if every German planning assumption had proven correct, even if American fuel depots had been captured intact, even if supplies had been delivered perfectly, even if no fuel was lost to combat or administrative waste, the offensive still lacked sufficient fuel to reach its objective. The comparison between German and Allied fuel availability revealed a disparity so enormous it made German offensive operations strategically absurd. American forces in Europe received approximately 200,000 gallons of fuel per day from depots continuously resupplied from ocean shipping. A single American armored division consumed approximately 30,000 gallons per day of normal operations, roughly what Germany's entire Ardennes offensive consumed per hour at peak. German forces in the West received approximately 60,000 gallons per day total from all sources in late 1944, amount barely sufficient for static defense and completely insufficient for offensive operations. The ratio was approximately 3-1 in America's favor daily, and that gap widened every day as American logistics improved while German logistics collapsed. British operational research teams studying the offensive reached conclusions that professional military educators would study for decades. A February 1945 report noted the German Ardennes offensive consumed fuel at 4.2 times the rate of delivery. This ratio makes sustained operations mathematically impossible regardless of tactical outcomes. Offensive culmination occurs when consumption exceeds delivery sufficiently that reserves exhaust. For the Germans, this occurred by December 24th, day 9 of operations, having achieved 40% of geographic objectives. The operation was doomed not by enemy action but by logistical mathematics that any competent staff officer should have recognized before the offensive launched. The report's language was diplomatic, but its implications were damning. Germany had executed an operation so logistically unsound that professional military planning should have prevented it. The vehicle loss accounting revealed how fuel shortage translated into military defeat more effectively than combat action. Total German armor committed to Ardennes offensive, approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns. Total losses by January 15th, approximately 600 vehicles. Of those losses, American intelligence estimated 47% destroyed in combat, 53% abandoned due to fuel shortage or mechanical failure, much of the latter category attributable to fuel-related problems. More than half of German armor losses were logistics failures rather than tactical defeats. Germany hadn't been outfought so much as outsupplied, hadn't lost battles so much as lost the supply war, hadn't been defeated tactically but rather defeated mathematically. The strategic comparison to Germany's 1940 victory in France provided the most damning indictment of the Ardennes planning. The 1940 campaign had consumed approximately 3 million gallons of fuel to achieve a 220-mile breakthrough that defeated France in 6 weeks. The Ardennes offensive consumed 2 million gallons to achieve a 50-mile penetration that accomplished nothing strategic and collapsed within 2 weeks. The fuel efficiency comparison. 1940 campaign achieved 0.7 miles per 1,000 gallons. Ardennes offensive achieved 0.5 miles per 1,000 gallons. Germany had become less fuel efficient over 4 years of war, burning more fuel to achieve less distance, and started the Ardennes offensive with proportionally less fuel than the 1940 campaign. If the mathematics of 1940 were successful, the mathematics of 1944 were suicidal. German post-action reports, the ones written by surviving officers and captured by Allied intelligence, were remarkable for their brutal honesty about fuel issues. Army Group B, Logistics Summary, January 3rd, 1945, offensive failed due to insufficient fuel allocation and inability to capture adequate enemy supplies. Available fuel carried forces approximately 40 miles. Continued operations beyond that point relied on fuel deliveries that could not be sustained and captured supplies that proved insufficient. Recommend future operations planned within available logistics rather than assuming optimistic supply conditions. The report was professional military assessment. We failed. Here's why. Don't repeat this mistake. Hitler's response to such reports was to order them destroyed, and the officers involved investigated for defeatism. Allied intelligence services' assessment of German fuel situation predicted the Reich's complete collapse within months. A January assessment noted Germany's synthetic fuel production remains below 10% of peak capacity. Natural petroleum sources are severed, strategic reserves are exhausted, current Wehrmacht fuel availability supports only limited defensive operations, offensive operations at any scale are logistically impossible. Assessment: Germany cannot sustain mobile warfare. Recommend continued pressure to prevent German forces from establishing stable defensive lines while fuel shortage limits their mobility. The assessment proved accurate. When Allied forces launched their next major offensives in February and March 1945, German defenders frequently retreated not because they were defeated but because they lacked fuel to reposition, creating routes where organised withdrawals should have occurred. The opportunity cost calculation, what Germany could have achieved with those resources used differently, haunted post-war analysis. The Ardennes offensive consumed 2 million gallons of fuel, 1,400 armoured vehicles, and approximately 100,000 casualties for tactical gains that were erased within 6 weeks. If those same resources had been used defensively on the Eastern Front, where Soviet offensives were preparing to overrun Germany's eastern territories, the war's final months might have looked different. Professional military analysts concluded the Ardennes offensive was Germany's single greatest strategic error of late 1944, wasting irreplaceable resources on an operation that competent logistics planning should have recognized as impossible. Hitler had gambled Germany's last reserves on a mathematically impossible operation and lost not through bad luck, but through predictable consequences of ignoring logistics. The final image crystallizing the mathematics of defeat appeared in American newspapers in February 1945. A photograph of the L'Église vehicle graveyard, dozens of German tanks sitting abandoned beside Belgian roads. The photo's caption read, "German armor abandoned for lack of fuel, testimony to the Third Reich's logistical collapse." American readers looking at that photograph couldn't see the fuel calculations, the planning failures, the staff officers creating two sets of documents, or the desperate measures attempting to power tanks with wood gas. They just saw impressive German machines sitting useless beside roads, but military professionals looking at the same photograph understood its real meaning. This was what happened when strategy divorced from logistics, when political will replaced mathematical reality, when a nation fought modern mechanized warfare without petroleum to sustain it. The mathematics had rendered their verdict in empty fuel tanks and abandoned armor. Germany had lost the arithmetic of war long before it lost the geography of war, and no amount of tactical brilliance or strategic ambition could overcome the simple equation that 0 gallons of fuel multiplied by any number of tanks equals 0 miles of advance. The mathematics of defeat were absolute, final, and had been visible to anyone willing to calculate honestly before the offensive began. 1956, a military staff college in the United States. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine and one of the Wehrmacht's most respected armored warfare theorists, addressed American officers studying the lessons of World War II. When asked to identify the decisive factor in Germany's defeat, Guderian didn't mention specific battles, tactical failures, or strategic decisions. Instead, he stated simply, "We lost the war at the gas pump long before we lost it on the battlefield." Germany never possessed sufficient petroleum to wage mechanized war against enemies who controlled global oil supplies. Everything else, tactics, courage, technology, was irrelevant when our tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. The Ardennes offensive didn't fail because of American resistance or German errors. It failed because modern armored warfare requires petroleum, and we had none. The American officers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected discussion of tactics and strategy. Instead, they were hearing about logistics and petroleum. But Guderian was teaching them the war's most important lesson. The strategic petroleum balance of World War II revealed an asymmetry so extreme that Germany's defeat was arguably predetermined by resource access rather than military factors. In 1944, Germany's total petroleum access from all sources, synthetic production, Romanian imports, captured Soviet and French reserves totaled approximately 1.5 million tons annually. The United States alone produced 227 million tons of petroleum in 1944. The Allied petroleum advantage was approximately 300 to 1. Germany was fighting a modern mechanized war with 0.3% of its enemy's petroleum resources. The disparity wasn't just unfavorable, it made victory impossible by simple arithmetic. The Wehrmacht's fuel consumption requirements for full-scale operations, meaning simultaneous active combat on eastern and western fronts, plus defensive operations in Italy and the Balkans, totaled approximately 7 to 10 million tons annually. Germany's 1944 petroleum availability was 1.5 million tons, meaning Germany could sustain 15 to 21% of the operations its strategic situation required. No military can operate at 15% of requirement and expect victory. The Ardennes offensive was merely the most visible manifestation of this impossible mathematics. Germany attempting to conduct offensive operations requiring 4.5 million gallons with 1.2 million gallons available. The same mathematics applied at every level of German military operations throughout 1943 through 1945. Germany was always fighting with 15 to 20% of the fuel it needed. The surprising thing wasn't that Germany lost. The surprising thing was that Germany held out as long as it did, operating under such extreme fuel poverty. The historical comparison to other nations' strategic resource situations revealed how uniquely disadvantaged Germany was by petroleum access. Japan in World War II faced severe oil shortages after losing access to Dutch East Indies petroleum, but at least Japan had access to those supplies through 1941 and early 1942. Germany never had comparable natural petroleum reserves. Britain fought World War II while importing all petroleum from overseas, but British shipping lines remained largely open until 1944, and Britain was allied with the United States. The Soviet Union's Baku oil fields gave the USSR natural petroleum access Germany never possessed. Only Germany attempted to fight a modern mechanized war entirely on synthetic petroleum and limited imports, and Germany's experience proved this strategy was unsustainable against enemies with abundant natural petroleum. The Ardennes offensive as microcosm revealed how petroleum shortage determined operational outcomes regardless of tactical skill. German planning, competent. German tactics, effective in many engagements. German troops, experienced and determined. German equipment, in many cases superior to American equivalents. 15% of requirement. Result: operational failure predetermined by fuel shortage. If every German tactical decision had been perfect, if every German attack had succeeded, if every German defensive position had held, the offensive still would have failed because fuel mathematics make sustained operations impossible when consumption exceeds supply by 700%. The Ardennes proved that petroleum availability determines operational outcomes more decisively than tactics, training, or technology. Modern military analysts studying the Ardennes offensive focus increasingly on logistics rather than tactics. For good reason, logistics determined everything. The opening artillery barrage was impressive but irrelevant when tanks couldn't advance beyond fuel range. Kampfgruppe Peiper's tactical skill was remarkable but meaningless when fuel exhaustion stopped the advance. American defensive stands at Bastogne and Street Vith were heroic but less decisive than the fuel shortage paralyzing German armor before it reached those positions. The military history traditionally focuses on battles, who attacked where, who defended how, which side won particular engagements. But the Ardennes teaches that battles matter less than logistics, that tactical outcomes are determined by operational fuel availability, and that no amount of tactical brilliance overcomes strategic resource insufficiency. The diplomatic and strategic implications of Germany's petroleum poverty suggest alternative historical paths that might have avoided war or changed its character. If Germany's leadership had recognized in the 1930s that modern mechanized warfare required petroleum access Germany didn't possess, several strategic options existed: develop defensively oriented military doctrine requiring less fuel, pursue diplomatic arrangements securing reliable petroleum access, or avoid military confrontation with petroleum-rich enemies. Hitler chose none of these options, instead pursuing aggressive expansion, expecting quick victories before petroleum shortage became critical. The 1940 victory in France seemed to validate this approach. Germany conquered France in 6 weeks on 3 million gallons, appeared to prove that lightning warfare could succeed before fuel shortages mattered. But lightning doesn't strike twice, and Germany's enemies learned, adapted, and ground the Wehrmacht down in campaigns where petroleum access determined outcomes more than tactical skill. The question of whether any German strategy could have secured sufficient petroleum for sustained warfare produces pessimistic answers. Romania's Ploiești fields produced roughly 200,000 barrels monthly until August 1944, helpful but insufficient. Capturing Soviet oil fields at Baku was a strategic objective that failed. Synthetic fuel production reached maximum capacity by early 1944, before Allied bombing destroyed it. German submarines attempting to import petroleum from Asia achieved negligible results. The realistic assessment suggests no achievable German strategy provided adequate petroleum for mechanized war against the Allies. Germany's strategic situation was fundamentally untenable, attempting to wage modern warfare without the petroleum resources such warfare requires. The Ardennes offensive was merely the final proof of impossibility that should have been obvious from the beginning. The lessons modern militaries draw from Germany's fuel catastrophe focus on logistics as war's ultimate determinant. American military doctrine now emphasizes that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, experts talk fuel. Modern operational planning begins with logistics assessment: what can be sustained, what can be supplied, what resources exist, rather than beginning with desired objectives and assuming logistics will somehow support them. The Ardennes offensive is taught at military colleges worldwide as an example of how not to plan operations. Never begin offensives without adequate logistics. Never assume capturing enemy supplies. Never let political will override mathematical reality. These lessons seem obvious in hindsight, but they weren't obvious to German planners in November 1944, or if they were obvious, those planners weren't permitted to say so. The contemporary relevance of the fuel lesson extends beyond military operations to strategic policy. Nations planning military operations must secure petroleum supply before committing to mechanized warfare. Alliances matter partly because they aggregate petroleum access across member states. Energy security is military security in any technological era where military forces require petroleum or its equivalents. The Ardennes offensive teaches that technological sophistication means nothing without fuel, that Tiger IIs without diesel are expensive sculptures, that tactical skill without operational mobility is helpless, that strategic ambition without logistical foundation is fantasy. These lessons apply to any era where military power depends on consumable resources and supply limitations determine operational possibilities. The final accounting of why Germany lost World War II must include petroleum shortage as primary cause rather than contributing factor. Germany lost because modern mechanized warfare requires petroleum, and Germany never had adequate petroleum for the enemies it fought. Technology helped. Allied technology often exceeded German capabilities by 1944. Numbers helped. Allied manpower and industrial production dwarfed German resources. Leadership mattered. Hitler's strategic decisions accelerated German defeat, but petroleum determined everything. With adequate fuel, German forces might have sustained operations longer, achieved more tactical success, forced costlier Allied victories. Without adequate fuel, no technology, leadership, or tactical skill could produce strategic victory. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last attempt to overcome petroleum mathematics through willpower, courage, and tactical skill. The abandoned vehicles littering Belgian roads by January 1945 proved that mathematics doesn't care about willpower, physics doesn't respect courage, and empty fuel tanks stop Tiger IIs as surely as they stop civilian cars. Present day, the Royal Museum of the Armed Forces and Military History, Brussels. Tourists visiting the World War II section encounter a King Tiger tank, beautifully restored, its 88mm gun impressive, its armor intimidating even in a museum setting. The information placard explains the vehicle's specifications: weight, 70 tons, armor up to 180mm thick, gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at 2 kilometers range. Then the placard's final line: abandoned December 1944, L'Église, Belgium. Reason: lack of fuel. The tourists photograph the tank, admire its engineering, and move on. But military historians and veterans stop at that placard, reading the final line again, understanding what it means. This tank represents the Ardennes offensive in miniature, technologically impressive, tactically formidable, and operationally useless. Because empty fuel tanks, this tank is Germany's war. Sophisticated, determined, doomed. Not by enemy action, but by simple mathematics that any quartermaster could have calculated, that any logistics officer should have recognized, that any honest planner would have acknowledged made victory impossible. The fuel lesson is absolute. Modern warfare runs on petroleum. Fight without adequate fuel, and you fight until your tanks stop moving. And Germany's tanks stopped moving 40 miles into an offensive plan to cover 125 miles, stopped by the same mathematics that had made German defeat inevitable from the moment Hitler chose war without petroleum to sustain it.